Chapter 780. That storage space was very strange. Even if he was stripped naked, he wouldn't be able to find it. Whenever he wanted to take something, he had to come by himself. Ning Xuemore knew that there should be a lot of things in the storage space. Otherwise, he wouldn't be able to change things at any time. What she didn't expect was that the ancestor actually brought a quilt with him at all times. No wonder he could go wherever he wanted to go. It was really convenient to have this storage space. She was lying there with the high and mighty god beside her. Ning Xuemore felt like she was dreaming. Before going to sleep, she was still guarding him in the ice shell. She was afraid and anxious. In this hall, she felt indescribably lonely and desolate. Now that the ancestor woke up and was lying beside her, even if the two of them didn't speak, her heart strangely calmed down. Between heaven and earth, it was quiet and peaceful. They could hear each other's breathing. They could reach out and hold each other's hands. The distance between them was neither too far nor too close, making her feel safe. "Did you have a nightmare just now?" After an unknown amount of time, the ancestor broke the silence and asked. Ning Xuemore was stunned. She shook her head and said, "No, I didn't. You just called out Shui Ilan." The ancestor's voice was neither fast nor slow. At this time, he naturally wasn't jealous. He knew how much this girl hated Shui Ilan. If she called out in her dream, it could only mean that she was frightened by him. Ning Xuemore thought for a moment. She couldn't remember her dreams. This time, it was also a blank. She couldn't remember anything. She shook her head and said, "I forgot. I can't remember anything in my dreams." The ancestor's eyes slightly deepened. "You can't remember even one of your dreams?" "Yes, I can't remember anything. I forget it when I wake up." Ning Xuemore answered casually. She had been like this since she was a child. She was already used to it. The ancestor didn't speak again. His hand was on her wrist. It was normal for people to not remember most of their dreams. However, they would occasionally remember a few. It was rare to see someone like Ning Xuemore who couldn't remember a single one. Could it be that there was something wrong with her soul? The moment he placed his hand on her wrist, he suddenly remembered that he had lost a great deal of his power, so he didn't have the power to examine her soul. Her wrist was delicate and smooth. The ancestor originally wanted to withdraw his hand, but at this time, he didn't want to. He just held her hand and didn't say anything. At first, Ning Xuemore thought that he was checking her pulse and had physical contact with him. Although she still felt a little strange in her heart, she still obediently let him hold her. Later, she saw that after he finished checking her pulse, he did not leave. Instead, he held her hand without moving or speaking. His palm was dry and warm. It was obviously the temperature of a normal person, but Ning Xuemore felt a little hot for no reason, making her body heat up for no reason. She wanted to withdraw her hand, but the ancestor held her hand tightly. He wouldn't let go, so she couldn't withdraw her hand. Forget it, it was just a handshake. She didn't need to care about it. Although she thought so, she was still a little nervous, and the two of them were a little quiet. Ning Xuemore slightly closed her eyes and raised her head to look at the starry sky. Such a good night always made people's hearts soften. "Ancestor." She opened her mouth to break the silence. "Are you still calling me ancestor?" The ancestor asked her. His eyes were slightly shining. Under the starlight, his picturesque eyebrows were as handsome as a celestial being. Ning Xuemore paused. She knew that she couldn't escape. Han. Great God Han. Since the other party was determined to expose her identity, it was useless for her to escape. Chapter 781. When did you recognize me? Well, not too long ago. In fact, Ning Xuemore and he had not known each other for long. This girl was still so slippery. "Since you recognized me, why didn't you say so?" The Di Zun pressed. Was there a need to say it? She was just a small shrimp in Jianghu who blindly exposed the great god's disguise. She was afraid that the great god would kill her. Xuemore knew that the Di Zun treated her well and seemed to treat her differently. However, he hid his identity, which meant that it was not time for her to recklessly expose him. Moreover, she was only his concubine in name, she did not want to be nosy. Whatever he wanted to play, she would accompany him to deal with various identities. Of course, this could not be said truthfully, so Ning Xuemore just smiled and did not speak. The Di Zun seemed to understand and sighed softly. Xuemore, have you always been so guarded against people? Ning Xuemore lowered her eyes. In fact, she also knew that her guard was very heavy and it was very difficult for her to trust people. She thought that this was an instinct trained as a secret agent, but now that she thought about it, it also seemed to be a problem. She did not want to continue this topic. The Di Zun, you, Zhu Li, the Di Zun said faintly. Ah! Ning Xuemore did not understand. Shenjiuli, my name. The Di Zun said word by word, still holding her hand. You can call my name when there is no one around. Ning Xuemore's heart suddenly jumped. She had long guessed that the Di Zun should have a real name. However, it seemed that no one on this continent knew. She did not expect that he would say it at this time. Her heart warmed. Shenjiuli, this name was really noble and suited his identity. However, in this world, was there anyone with the surname Shen? The Di Zun now told her his real name. Did he mean to open his heart to her? Her heart suddenly beat wildly. Shenjiuli had been holding Ning Xuemore's hand, and his thumb was also on her pulse. Naturally, he could feel her heart beating wildly. In the blue night, his eyes were shining like stars, and there seemed to be a flash of a smile. Are you nervous? His body leaned towards Xuemore, his eyes shining as he looked at her. Di Zun was very close to her, so close that Ning Xuemore could hear his steady heartbeat. Ning Xuemore was somewhat flustered. Tonight, Di Zun seemed to be taking advantage of his victory to pursue something, not giving her a chance to escape or take a breather. She coughed. Di Zun, Jolie. Shenjiuli corrected her. Julie. Ning Xuemore finally called out his name. She didn't know why, but when the name came out of her mouth, there was a faint pain in the depths of her heart, as if there was a thin string pulling there, making her eyes inexplicably warm. She cursed in her heart. Tonight was very evil. She seemed to be very emotional, not like her usual self at all. She calmed herself down and looked around. This place is so beautiful. However, it was not like the great god's taste at all. Ning Xuemore did not dare to say the last sentence out loud. She was actually very curious. Di Zun. She called out, but when she saw that his face was not good, she quickly changed her words. I will call you great god. I am more used to calling you that. She did not know why, but she was not willing to call him by his real name. Shenjiuli did not care. He just wanted to tell her his real name. As for whether she would call him by his real name, it was her business. What do you want to say? Shenjiuli twirled a strand of her hair and played with it. Obviously, he acquiesced to her name. Chapter 782. Ning Xuemore finally heaved a sigh of relief. This is the place where you practice, right? You must come here often, right? It's very pleasing to the eye and very beautiful. Also, the spiritual energy here is very abundant. I don't come here often. Shenjiuli's voice was faint. It's boring to be here alone. He was also afraid of boredom. Ning Xuemore was very surprised. I heard that the most suitable places for meditation and cultivation are very quiet and remote places. Almighty, don't you choose such places for meditation? Logically speaking, this place was very suitable for cultivation. Shenjiuli said, I practice in other places. How could the Almighty not choose such a beautiful place? Then your practice place must be very beautiful too, right? With the Almighty's personality, his practice place must be more poetic and picturesque. It's average. Shenjiuli's words were always concise. He was not lying. His practice place was an ice cave. There was nothing in the ice cave except for an ice bed. I don't believe you. Maybe the night was too beautiful, or maybe they had opened their hearts a little. And he was no longer so high and mighty. Ning Xuemore talked to him casually. You need to be calm when you practice. Avoid being confused by the things around you, so the simpler the practice place, the better. Shenjiuli explained to her. But he was a little absent-minded. With his cultivation, he could meditate quickly even in a busy city and would not be disturbed by external things. If he wanted to practice, he could do it anywhere. But this place was not suitable. This place was very quiet and full of spiritual energy. He did not even have to worry about being disturbed in this place. But he could not. Every time he came here, he was inexplicably impetuous and could not calm down. So he gave up on this place and would not come here again for many years. This time, if he did not accidentally fall into the dark forest and was seriously injured and in need of treatment, he would not come here. Ning Xuemore actually understood his reasoning, but she was a little regretful. Even so, this place is so well built. It's a pity that you did not come here to practice. This place was not built by me. It had always existed. It has existed for at least 3,000 years. Shunjiuli explained, I discovered this place by accident. Ning Xuemore was surprised. She didn't expect that this place was actually left behind by an ancestor more than 3,000 years ago. She originally wanted to ask about the two sabers, but now it seemed that there was no need to ask. The ancestor probably didn't know either. Those jellyfish paths outside were created by Di Zun, right? It seemed that he was the only one who could walk, so it must have something to do with him. Shunjiuli shook his head again. Everything here is from 3,000 years ago, including the jellyfish road. But why did they only allow you to leave? Chapter 783. Ning Xuemore seemed to be used to his touch and didn't notice it at all. When she heard that she could stay for a few more days, she immediately smiled and said, of course. She really liked this place and wanted to stay for a few more days, but she finally thought of a very important problem. But there's nothing to eat here. She hadn't eaten anything for a whole night, so she was hungry. As if it was a coincidence, her stomach immediately grumbled a few times. Although the sound wasn't very loud, Shunjiuli, who was close by, also heard it. He seemed to have finally thought of this fatal problem. He could abstain from food, but Ning Xuemore couldn't. He suddenly felt a little scared. Fortunately, he had only fainted for a day. If it had been a little longer, this girl might have starved to death here. Even the weakest of his disciples was at least Earth rank level 3 and had reached the level of abstaining from food for more than a month. The people around him were also like this, so his thinking was habitual and he didn't consider that this little girl was actually as fragile as glass. If he didn't consider it carefully, he could have caused fatal damage to her. Just like the hairpin that he spent an entire night carving, if he accidentally pinched it, it would be crushed. Since he considered that she was hungry, Ning Xuemore's stomach finally reacted and growled one after another. It was especially loud in the quiet night. Ning Xuemore blushed. It was too embarrassing. She was screaming like this. Shunjiuli looked at her red face and couldn't help but laugh. He raised his hand and rubbed her hair. If you're hungry, then you're hungry. There's nothing to be embarrassed about. Wait. He turned over and got off the bed. She didn't know where he took out a fishing rod and walked out. Ning Xuemore's heart couldn't help but jump when he rubbed her hair. She was also dazzled by his smile. When she reacted, Shunjiuli had already walked out. She was a little curious. She had already seen the water. Other than those jellyfish, she didn't see any other creatures. What could he catch with a fishing rod? She simply turned over and got off the bed and followed him out. The night was cold as water. After all, it was early winter, and this place was unusually cold. Ning Xuemore didn't feel it when she was in bed, but once she walked out, she still felt a little uncomfortable and shivered. Wear it. Shunjiuli was sitting cross-legged on a futon, fishing. One end of the long fishing rod was in the water, and the other end was in his hand. As if sensing her approach, he casually tossed her a cloak. The cloak looked very thin, but it was very warm when wrapped around the body. Ning Xuemore put it on without hesitation, walked to his side, and looked into the water. After all, it was night time and they couldn't see anything clearly. What's in the water? She was curious. Good stuff, he replied. Shunjiuli motioned for her to sit next to him and warned her, be good and don't make any noise. That thing is afraid of noise. Ning Xuemore looked at the praying mat that appeared beside him out of thin air. The Almighty's praying mat could really appear wherever he went. She inexplicably thought of Yi Qinghuan's collection. It seemed that there were 2 praying mats. The Almighty had too many praying mats. It seemed that he had a habit of throwing them everywhere. No wonder someone picked them up as a souvenir. A thought suddenly came to her mind. She remembered hearing Yi Qingwan say that she used to cultivate in the dark forest. Di Zun also came to the dark forest to see her. Did Di Zun also bring Yi Qingwan here? She wanted to ask the Almighty, but he said not to make any noise. Ning Xuemo used her foot to push the praying mat. It was too close to him. If she sat on it, she would directly lean on him. Chapter 784. She wanted to move the futon away a little, but it seemed to be rooted there. She couldn't move it. Shinjoli finally looked at her with a faint smile. "Are you afraid that something on me will bite you?" He transmitted his voice, so he wouldn't disturb the things in the water. Ning Xuemo paused for a moment. Forget it. She was not a shy person. Occasionally, when the mission required, she would put her arm around a man's shoulder. She sat down next to Shinjoli, and the two of them leaned against each other. Her warm and soft body leaned on his arm, with the unique fragrance of a young girl. She sat next to him by the lakeside. A gentle breeze blew, and Xuemo's hair lightly brushed against his face and neck. It was cool and slightly ticklish, making him have the urge to hug her in an instant. But thinking of Rongyue Tianlan's plan of taking things slowly, he stopped again. He couldn't scare her away and break the peace that he had obtained with great difficulty. He was a straightforward person. He would do whatever he wanted to do, but now he had scruples. The person he loved was by his side, but he couldn't hug her. Ning Xuemo's eyes were fixed on the fishing rod. She suddenly thought of a very important question. Great God, there isn't even a blade of grass or a stove here. How are you going to cook the fish you caught? She also learned to transmit her voice. Although she was not very experienced, the two of them were so close that Shinjoli could still hear it clearly. He glanced at her sideways, and his eyes flashed slightly. He sighed softly. Recently, I have lost a lot of power. It is very tiring to transmit my voice. This sentence was said directly in her ear, and his voice was slightly weak. Ning Xuemo immediately remembered that he was in a state of near death in the first half of the night. She immediately believed his words. Looking at his side face, she was a little worried. Then you don't have to transmit your voice. Are you okay? Shinjoli leaned his body on her. I am a little cold. Come closer to me, it is easier to talk, and we can snuggle to get warmth. Ning Xuemo, the Almighty was actually quite cute when he was weak. Seeing that his face was indeed pale, she was afraid that he would faint again and turn into an ice sculpture. If that happened, her stomach would be empty again. He leaned against Ning Xuemo. Xuemo looked at his pale, almost transparent face, then at his long eyelashes that fluttered like a small fan. Looking at his gorgeous face, Ning Xuemo finally forgot about his high and mighty status as a venerable emperor. She seemed to have just discovered that he was also an extremely young romantic youth. He was so fragile that it could melt anyone's heart into a bag of water. Besides, her food depended on his fishing rod, so Ning Xuemo was really concerned about him. She took off her cloak and wanted to put it on him. Shinjoli was still very considerate of her. He stopped her. It's cold here. If you take it off, you will catch a cold. This cloak is not small. Let's wear it together. Ning Xuemo thought about it and agreed. She was now seizing every second to cultivate, so she really could not catch a cold. Anyway, now that their bodies were leaning against each other, it was not a big deal to wear a cloak together. So she pulled the cloak, and the two of them were wrapped together. In this way, the two of them were stuck together like Siamese fish. There was no gap between the two of them. The blue night, the tranquil lake, the dreamlike castle, and the two of them snuggling together. Shinjoli suddenly felt unprecedentedly satisfied. It was as if he had finally found the other half of himself that he had lost for many years. His heart was warm and moved. An arm reached out and gently wrapped around her waist. Chapter 785. When he first came here, he only felt lonely. Now that he had her by his side, he suddenly felt that this place was so beautiful and picturesque. Because he was greedy for this warmth, he almost didn't want to let the fish take the bait. However, considering her empty stomach, he felt that he couldn't be so cruel. Just as he was feeling conflicted, the first stupid fish took the bait. Ning Xuemore finally saw the most exotic fish in the world. A transparent fish. This fish looked like salmon, but its body was completely transparent. Even its internal organs were transparent. If she didn't hold it in her hand, she would never believe that there was such a transparent fish in this world. The fish's body seemed to be carved out of crystal, and it struggled unwillingly between Ning Xuemore's fingers. This fish looked so artistic that Ning Xuemore almost couldn't bear to eat it. Shunjiuli put away the fishing rod, and with a flick of his sleeve, a small stove appeared on the ground. There was also a small pot on the stove, and the water in the pot was bubbling and steaming. Ning Xuemore was dumbstruck. How many things does the ancestor have on him? Great God, is there anything you didn't bring with you? Ning Xuemore squatted beside him and watched him quickly clean up the fish. She was full of admiration and envy. She looked at the pot again. Won't the soup spill out in your space? No, the storage space has the function of preserving freshness and shape. The things you put in will be the same when you take them out. It's more reliable than outside, Shunjiuli answered without raising his head. The way he handled the fish was also something Ning Xuemore had never seen before. A white light shot out from his fingertip, and the fish spun in the air. When the white light stopped, the fish had already been scaled and its internal organs were removed. It was ready to be put into the pot. He put the whole fish into the pot, and his voice was still indifferent. This water-divine fish is the most nutritious when cooked. It's suitable for people who cultivate the wood attribute. Wasn't that just right for her? Ning Xuemore's eyebrows curved, and she couldn't help but sigh. I didn't expect that you, as the ancestor, would do such trivial things. She thought that he was a person who didn't do household chores. Shunjiuli's fingers paused slightly, and he didn't say anything. This skill seemed to have been with him for as long as he could remember. The long years were too boring, and he cultivated countless interests to pass the time. For example, playing chess, playing the zither, playing the flute, raising pets, making all kinds of strange things. No matter what he did, he was the best. When there was no room for improvement, his interest would change. He had countless interests, but the only one he had never studied was culinary skills. After all, a gentleman should stay away from the kitchen. He had already abstained from eating, so there was no need for him to do such things. It was just that when he was in the mood to cook some food, it wasn't because he was hungry, but purely because he was bored. But even so, his culinary skills were still top-notch. No matter what food he made, he could accurately control the heat and taste. Great God, is there anything you don't have in your storage space? Ning Xuemore was still very curious. She was bored anyway, so she wanted to gossip. There's nothing for you. Shunjiuli's answer was very simple and irritating. Ning Xuemore was speechless. Well, for the sake of the fish, she didn't care. How did you cultivate this storage space? Can you teach me? Ning Xuemore was very envious of his storage space. Sure. Take me as your master. Shunjiuli was still very happy. Chapter 786. Ning Xuemore. She could not understand the great god's train of thought. At the same time, she thought of a very confusing question. Speaking of which, if Han Shanyu regained his status as an overlord, then did her status as a concubine still count? Seeing his intimate actions towards her after waking up, it should count. But now, he wanted her to be his disciple. He must be joking when he said that he was going to be his disciple. Who would want their concubine to be his disciple? She also said jokingly, if I really become your disciple, will you accept me? Shunjiuli glanced at her and asked, why not? I heard that the great god's standards for accepting disciples are very strict. Those who are not Earth stage level 3 and above will not be accepted. I am mortal stage level 7, I am still far from that. Ah, right, I also heard that you are going to publicly accept disciples this time. Ning Xuemore thought of the group of young newcomers she saw when she passed by. Oh. Shunjiuli gave her a one-word reply. This one word was too general. Ning Xuemore was a little confused. Shunjiuli raised his hand and rubbed her head. So you have to work hard. Work hard for what? Work hard to reach his standards for accepting disciples? But she was only mortal stage level 7, even if she did not eat or drink, with her crazy genius speed, she would only be able to break through the highest point of the mortal stage and enter the earth stage in 5 days. This was under the ideal situation where there were no accidents, and his condition was earth stage 3rd rank. Even if she was a Chilean, she would not be able to catch up. The cultivation speed of normal geniuses was that when they were in the mortal stage, it was already very good to be able to rise 1 level in a year. Moreover, the higher the level, the harder it was to rise. After reaching mortal stage level 6, one might not even be able to rise 1 level in 3 to 4 years. And from the highest point of the mortal stage to the earth stage, it would take 8 to 10 years. This was the cultivation speed of normal geniuses. For example, Ji Yunhao, unless it was a genius who broke through to the earth stage at a very young age, such as Ji Yunhuang. But such geniuses were rare, and these rare geniuses were mostly gathered in Buddha Lotus Mountain. It seemed that becoming his disciple was a fantasy, so Ning Xuemo simply did not think about it. What are you thinking about? Shenjioli handed her a jade bowl. Inside the bowl was a milky white soup with white jade-like pieces of fish floating in it. Try it. How does it taste? The fragrance was intoxicating. This fragrance immediately made Ning Xuemo forget what she was thinking. She immediately tasted it. The taste was extremely delicious, and it was especially suitable for her taste. Delicious. She gave him a thumbs up and praised him sincerely. She was starving and immediately began to enjoy the food. After she finished half a bowl, her hunger finally subsided. After soothing her stomach, she inadvertently raised her head and saw him sitting opposite her. He was looking at her lazily with his hand supporting his head. There seemed to be a slight smile on his lips. Ning Xuemo felt a little uncomfortable being stared at. This great god was all about perfection. Did the way she wolfed down the food just now scare him? Why aren't you eating? Ning Xuemo was a little embarrassed. Shenjioli paused and retracted his gaze. Actually, it didn't matter to him whether he ate or not. However, seeing that she was eating so happily, he would accompany her and eat a bowl. He took out another jade bowl and filled it to the brim. After tasting it, his eyebrows slightly wrinkled. Isn't it a little salty? He actually liked bland food, but every time he made something, it was a little salty. Ning Xuemo shook her head. No, it's just right for me. It was as if he made it according to her taste. Chapter 787. Ning Xuemo had never eaten such delicious stewed fish. Shenjioli didn't say anything and sat there to eat. Ning Xuemo stole a glance at his table manners. She couldn't help but praise in her heart that it was perfect. The Almighty could even eat so naturally, like a poem or a painting. The fish soup was delicious. Ning Xuemo ate 2 bowls of soup with water and was finally satisfied. She looked at the jade bowl in her hand and sighed. The bowl that the Almighty casually took out was also a priceless treasure. It was carved out of a whole piece of fine jade. There were cloud-like patterns on it, simple and elegant. She suddenly remembered that there was also a jade bowl in Yi Qingwan's collection. But at that time, her mind was full of thoughts of escaping, so she didn't care about those things at all. She just glanced at it and vaguely felt that the bowl was similar to this one. Xuemo couldn't help but ask, Almighty, do you often bring your disciples here to cultivate? Did he once bring Yi Qingwan here to fish? Did he make fish soup for her? Shenjioli glanced at her. Usually, when I accept them, I will kick them to the dark forest to cultivate for 3 days. It depends on their reaction speed and aptitude. It's so dangerous here, you must accompany them often, right? No. Shenjioli answered simply, if they can't even solve the danger here, how can they be qualified to be my disciple? It was indeed the Almighty's style. Ning Xuemo's tone was both intentional and unintentional. But, I heard from Yi Qingwan that you have accompanied her here before. Is it because she is a girl, so you take care of her? Shenjioli pondered for a moment and said lightly, it's not to accompany her, but to pick her up 3 days later. Among all the disciples, she is the weakest and has the worst sense of direction. With her ability, she can't get out of the maze illusion ahead. He glanced at Ning Xuemo again, and there seemed to be a smile in his eyes. Was she jealous? However, I can make an exception for you, Shinjoli added. Ning Xuemore didn't understand. What exception? If you come here to train in the future, I can accompany you here at any time. Ning Xuemore, the Almighty still wanted to take her as his disciple. She didn't want to let the doubts in her heart churn back and forth, so she simply asked, Great God, now that you've recovered your identity, then I, as a shield concubine, won't be used anymore, right? Can I leave now that I've succeeded? Shinjoli looked at her unfathomably. Do you hate this identity? Nonsense. Who would be willing to be a concubine? Ning Xuemore didn't say anything, but she expressed her meaning with her eyes. Shinjoli held her hand and led her inside. Then work hard and become my disciple. Ning Xuemore, the Almighty's disciple, fought so hard, and he gave her this opportunity. Could it be that he saw that she was doing a good job as a shield concubine and wanted to give her a small benefit? He had been touching her for the past 2 days, and all his actions seemed to mean that he was using her as a pillow. It made her think that he was pursuing her, and she was a little conflicted, wondering how to reject him. Now that he suddenly had the intention to take her as his disciple, was she thinking too much? In his era, there should be a taboo for a master and disciple relationship, right? Ning Xuemore vaguely heard that he hated a master and disciple relationship. Now that he suddenly wanted to take her as his disciple, was he afraid that she would pester him with the identity of a concubine in the future, so that he could completely destroy her imagination? Chapter 788. Ning Xuemore couldn't figure it out. Unknowingly, she was led into the room and onto the bed. By the time she reacted, she had already been stuffed into the bed. He also loosened his outer robe, lifted the other side of the blanket, and crawled in. He casually pulled her into his arms. All right, time to sleep. Ning Xuemore was speechless. She struggled out of his arms. Guru, didn't you want to take me as your disciple? Why were they sharing a bed now? Well, you're not my disciple yet. So you're still my concubine. He pulled Xuemore back and hugged her in his arms. He closed his eyes and yawned. After so long, aren't you sleepy? Ning Xuemore was speechless. But she was a little mad and wanted to ask again. But as soon as she opened her mouth, he leaned down and kissed her lips gently. His breath was a little hot. I'll give you 2 choices. 1. Continue to be my concubine. 2. Be my disciple. But to be my disciple, you need to cultivate hard. I don't want to be too selfish. Do you understand? Was he forcing her to be his disciple? Ning Xuemore suddenly had an epiphany. He suddenly made an exception to take in disciples this year, and there were no restrictions on gender. Was it actually to take her in? She held her breath. If I can't be your disciple, will I have to be your concubine for the rest of my life? He closed his eyes and didn't answer her directly. So you have to become stronger. He was actually preparing to make Ning Xuemore his wife. However, with her current aptitude, it was absolutely impossible. Once she was crowned as the Empress, she wouldn't be able to survive the tribulation. She had to cultivate to the heavenly level in order to safely survive the tribulation with his help and not turn into ashes. As for taking in a disciple, it was imperative. First, others couldn't help her cultivate to the heavenly level. Even if there was someone who could help her cultivate, he didn't want his future wife to be trained by others. Why would he let others take advantage of something that he could do? Second, of course, it was to punish her a little. Didn't she make up a master-disciple relationship? Then he would fall in love with her once and make this a reality. His identity was special, and his words were like gold and jade, so there were some things that he could not say out loud. If he were to speak of it, it would be easily known by the will of the heavens, and it would then attract the divine lightning. Therefore, he couldn't tell Ning Xuemore his true thoughts. In any case, to him, whether it was his wife or concubine, she would always be by his side to accompany him. There was no difference. How could Ning Xuemore know the twists and turns in his heart? To be honest, when she heard that he wanted to take her as his disciple, she was actually slightly relieved. After all, she didn't know what kind of feelings she had for him. If the ancestor were to force her to be his wife now, she would probably risk her life to refuse. Now, there was finally another path, and this path was also a shortcut for her to quickly become stronger. The premise was that she was strong enough to reach Earth Stage Level 3 in 5 days. But could she create a miracle? Her heart was racing. Although she was tired, she couldn't fall asleep and couldn't help but toss and turn. Suddenly, her waist tightened. He stretched out his arms and hugged her. His eyes were as deep as the stars in the dark night. "Why are you moving around? Do you want this lord to be unable to control himself and consummate with you now?" Ning Xuemore's body stiffened, and her heart was secretly stunned. "Lord Ancestor, why does it feel like the word consummate from your mouth is ruining your image?" Chapter 789. In Ning Xuemore's mind, a god like Di Zun should have no desires and shouldn't have the desires of a normal man. She was in his arms, her body half pressed against his, and she could clearly feel the subtle changes in his body. Ning Xuemore knew that he wasn't just threatening her. She finally didn't dare to move and closed her eyes. Sleep, sleep, she was sleepy, she wanted to sleep. She was trying to hypnotize herself when she suddenly felt a warm sensation on her lips. She opened her eyes and met his slightly curved eyes. Her heart raced. A small compensation for not being able to consummate the marriage. He chuckled and closed his eyes. "All right, go to sleep." The night was dark, and she finally fell asleep. She slept peacefully in his arms. She didn't know when he opened his eyes, but he looked at her for a long time. He had been sleeping alone for thousands of years. Now that she was in his arms, he didn't feel uncomfortable. He even felt a little satisfied, as if she should have slept in his arms a long time ago. It was as if he had been used to hugging her for thousands of years, and now he was just finding this habit. He really couldn't consummate the marriage with her now. Cultivating a virgin body was the fastest. Once he lost his virginity, his cultivation speed would drop by half. After all, he wasn't an ordinary person. With her current body, she might not be able to bear his love. Once she bore his love, she wouldn't be able to cultivate and break through to the heaven realm. If he wanted her for a few decades, he naturally didn't have to worry about this. But what he wanted now was a long time, so he had to be very careful. So he could only hug her, and hug her again. He couldn't do anything substantial. After looking at her for a while, he also closed his eyes and silently adjusted his breathing. No one knew that the wolf soul wood was his nemesis, but he was usually very strong. When he came down, as long as he was a little careful, these things wouldn't hurt him. But this time, he was already an arrow at the end of its flight. In order to save her, he had no choice but to use himself as a cushion. He smashed into the wolf soul wood, and his body was pierced by them. One of them even hurt his heart meridian. This time, his injuries were unprecedentedly severe. He had to force himself to bring Ning Xuemore to this place. Actually, the injury on his back could be healed by himself, but he was afraid that if he left Ning Xuemore outside, with her bad constitution, who knew what kind of disaster she would cause. Therefore, he used the last of his strength to bring her to this place and keep her by his side to protect her. What he didn't expect was that his attack would be so severe this time. Not only was he unconscious, but he also had a high fever. In the end, he even froze. However, his coma was different from others. After he fainted, his consciousness was drifting outside, so he could see and sense everything. Ning Xuemore carried him onto the bed, carried him off the bed, wiped his body, and snuggled in his arms to keep him warm. He knew all these. It wasn't that she wasn't touched. He thought that Xuemore didn't have any feelings for him. At most, they were just companions. He didn't expect that she would go to this extent for him. If it was another man in the same situation as him, she might help treat him, but she definitely wouldn't go into his arms, right? So he should be a little different in her heart. He seemed to be an indifferent person who didn't care about anything. But that was just something that didn't make him work hard for. In fact, he was very domineering in his bones. I'm actually quite domineering in my bones, so domineering that I want votes. Chapter 790. For thousands of years, the ancestor had never fancied a single person. Now that he fancied one, he naturally wouldn't let her run away. He had to chase her down in order to be satisfied. Besides, only a person like him was worthy of being Shuemore's husband. As for the others, they didn't even need to think about it. He once again pulled her into his arms, his movements gentle. Perhaps she was too tired, but she didn't realize it. She even subconsciously nuzzled her head into his chest. This small act of trust caused the ancestor's eyes to deepen. He couldn't help but kiss Ning Shuemore's forehead before falling asleep with satisfaction. Early the next morning, Ning Shuemore woke up to find that the ancestor wasn't in bed. She breathed a sigh of relief, but also a bit panicked. She was afraid that the ancestor had left her here in a fit of excitement. She jumped out of bed and looked around. Finally, she found him at the lakeside. He was stewing something in a small pot. The rich aroma caused Shuemore to drool. So the ancestor had woken up early in the morning to stew something for her. Ning Shuemore was moved. She immediately ran over and asked, "What are you stewing?" "Cloud pig fillet." Shinjoli was meditating on a nearby praying mat. He opened his eyes as he heard her movement. Ning Shuemore didn't know what a cloud pig was, but it smelled so good that it was definitely delicious. Not only was there meat in the pot, but there were also other delicacies like mushrooms and mushrooms. "Hey, what are those blood-red slices?" Ning Shuemore asked the question in her heart. "That's the blood jade lingji that you swindled from the 8th princess. It's perfect to eat with this meat," Shinjoli explained to her. Ning Shuemore subconsciously retorted, "What do you mean swindled? I exchanged for it." "Hey, how come it's with you?" Ning Shuemore remembered that all of her treasures were hidden in the clothes she wore on Carefree Island. At the time, in order to enter that mud shell, she had changed her clothes. Naturally, she had forgotten all of her treasures on Carefree Island. Could it be that the ancestor not only brought back her body, but also all her treasures? Shinjoli didn't answer her. Instead, he threw her a small bag. "Your pitiful belongings are in this bag. Take it." The small pouch was only the size of a palm, but Ning Shuemore's heart skipped a beat. This seemed to be a Chenkuan pouch that could hold anything. She picked it up and looked at it. The design was very simple. It was snow-white in color, and there was a plum blossom drawn on the corner of the bag. It was sparse and slanted, looking very lifelike. Ning Shuemore could almost smell the fragrance of the plum blossoms. Needless to say, this painting was the work of the Almighty. She opened the bag again, her heart almost bubbling with joy. Not a single one of her belongings was missing. They were all inside. Even her banknotes were all there. She was overjoyed and was about to flip through it again. A hand reached out from the side and closed the opening of her storage bag. Shinjoli's voice faintly sounded out. "These things are all worldly possessions. Your current task is to focus all of your energy on cultivating. First, use the lotus leaf scattering technique and meditate for 2 hours." As he spoke, he put away her pouch. Ning Shuemore, she looked at the pot of meat. "Can I eat before I go?" "No. During these 2 hours, you must meditate and discard all distracting thoughts. If you don't reach the 8th level within these 2 hours, you are not allowed to eat." So strict. She hadn't even become his disciple and he was already strict with her. Level up within 2 hours. Did the Almighty think she had some sort of super cheat? However, since he put forth such a request, she would do her best to fulfill it. In any case, becoming stronger was her most pressing desire right now. Monthly votes, recommendation votes, recommendation votes. She could vote every day. Chapter 791. Ning Shuemore smiled and said, "Okay." She didn't say anything else and started to practice according to his instructions. According to his instructions, she sat by the lake facing the southeast direction and used the corresponding technique to regulate her breath. After a while, she felt abundant water spiritual energy gathering in her body. The speed of gathering spiritual energy was 3 times faster than usual. She was overjoyed. She concentrated even more. After an hour, Shuemore's body suddenly flashed with a light green light and covered her whole body. After a while, the light green light dissipated and she jumped up. "I did it. She actually did it." And it was ahead of time. She was so happy that her eyes were curved. She couldn't help but look in the direction where Shinjoli was sitting, but found that he wasn't there. Only the pot of meat was drying there, and the temperature was just right. There was a note next to it: after eating the meat, you can go to the cloud bed and practice for 4 hours. Use the wood lotus cultivation method. The content of the note was very simple, but it filled up her entire day. It could change every 4 hours or every 2 hours. The cultivation method used every 2 hours was different, and the posture of meditation was also different. Where was he? Did he leave again? Ning Xuemore looked around and didn't see the shadow of the ancestor. Obviously, he had left. Ning Xuemore exhaled and ate the meat in the pot first. After eating, she felt that her body gradually became hot and the heat in her body was surging. It was so hot that she couldn't wait to take off all her clothes. She thought of the cloud bed and hurriedly ran in. The original quilt on the cloud bed was gone, and only a small futon was left in the middle of the bed. Obviously, it was prepared for her. It seemed that he had thought of everything for her. Ning Xuemore jumped on the bed and hurriedly sat on the futon. As soon as she sat on it, a line of words appeared in front of her: practice here. Take off all your clothes. No wonder he left. It turned out that practicing here required her to take off all her clothes. He wanted to avoid arousing suspicion. It seemed that he was a true gentleman. Even though Ning Xuemore was sitting on the praying mat, she still felt hot and uncomfortable. Although she had some misgivings when she saw the words, she still took off her clothes without saying a word. Strangely enough, after taking off his clothes and sitting on the praying mat, he felt much more comfortable. She lowered her head and looked at herself. Was she performing on some kind of jade praying mat? Fortunately, there was no one here. Otherwise, looking at her like this, she would probably be labeled as a slut. Time was of the essence, so she put away her wild thoughts and meditated according to the method left on the ancestor's note. The cloud bed was extremely cold. Although it was separated by a praying mat, it was still uncomfortable to sit on it for a while. Ning Xuemore was lucky to have eaten the pot of meat, which was enough to resist the cold. The heat flow in his body and the ice flow on the cloud bed suddenly collided. The feeling was indescribably uncomfortable. It was obviously extremely cold, but sweat was dripping from her forehead. Fortunately, Ning Xuemore was very resilient. She closed her eyes and endured it. She also used another method to adjust the ice flow and heat flow. Time passed by. She didn't know how long it had been. Under the adjustment of her method, the hot and cold flow suddenly merged together. At the same time, her body emitted a light green light. Ning Xuemore looked inside her body at the spiritual root in her sea of qi. She saw that the green spiritual root, which represented the wood element, had grown into a sparkling green jade. Level 9. She was at level 9. Ning Xuemore almost jumped up. Merry Christmas to all the readers. Dear readers, please vote for me. Chapter 792. Ning Xuemore liked it so much that she even spun a few rounds on the spot. Her curtain-like long hair flowed along with her movements. She was as beautiful as a mountain spirit. After she finished spinning, she suddenly realized that she was not wearing any clothes. Luckily, she was the only one here. Even if she danced here, no one would see her. After all, her original body was a 21 or 22-year-old girl. She usually suppressed it, but now that she was happy, she burst out with the young girl's nature. She simply spun and danced here. She was dancing the tango dance that she liked the most in her era. She twisted her waist and swayed her hips. Her movements were skillful and explosive. She even hummed a song that matched the beat. She was very happy. Amidst the layers of green Buddha lotuses, there was a lotus throne that was made up of countless Buddha lotuses. Shinjoli sat on it with his eyes closed. A white fog surrounded him and spun around him. He was obviously meditating to recover, and the spiritual energy of the Buddhist lotuses here helped him recover much faster. He originally found that this place gathered the spiritual energy of heaven and earth and was a good place to cultivate. However, every time he came here, he felt uneasy and couldn't calm down. Therefore, he rarely came here to recover and cultivate. This time, after he gave the main hall to Ning Xuemore, he didn't want to be too far away from her, so he chose to come here to recover. Maybe it was because he knew that she was in the main hall not far away. This time, when he meditated here again, his mood was very stable and he entered into a meditative state in an instant. He could already do whatever he wanted when he entered a meditative state. He would wake up when the time ended. When he woke up 4 hours later, he calculated that she should have finished cultivating on the cloud bed and was about to enter the next step. He raised his hand and the water under the lotus platform rose up and formed a water mirror in front of him. The image in the water mirror gradually became clearer. When he saw the person in the mirror clearly, his body swayed and he almost fell off the lotus platform. The beautiful person in the mirror was dancing. Her movements were enchanting and bold. He had never seen such a charming spirit before. It was eye-catching. Shinjoli's finger that was holding the water mirror trembled. Splash! With a sound, the water mirror turned into waves and fell into the lake. This bold and impudent girl, she actually danced this kind of dance naked in the main hall. Didn't she know that her actions could easily turn a person as calm as still water into a wolf? Fortunately, this scene only fell into his eyes, and no one else saw it. He calmed himself down and suppressed the surging qi and blood in his lower abdomen. He cursed in his heart and took out a white sound transmission talisman without another word. Ning Xuemore was dancing to her heart's content. Suddenly, she saw the clothes she had placed beside her flashing. She was astonished. She jumped down and picked it up to take a look. A sound transmission talisman as white as snow fell out. It was this that was shining. Ning Xuemore raised her eyebrows. Yelu Jing'an had given her a light green sound transmitting talisman. She had never seen this white one before. Her heart skipped a beat. Could it be that the Almighty left it for her? Raising his hand to answer the call, he lazily said hello as if he was making a normal call. Hello, who is this? Did you have a good time? A cold voice came from the voice transmission talisman. It was the Almighty's voice. Yes, I had a good time. Ning Xuemore answered casually. After answering, she suddenly felt that something was wrong. She hurriedly covered her chest with her clothes and looked around in disbelief. Of course, she didn't see anything like a camera, but from his tone, he obviously saw everything. Ha ha ha, the Almighty saw everything. I saw it too. I saw the tickets in your pockets. Merry Christmas, dear ones. Chapter 793. Recalling her hot and sexy dance from before, Ning Xuemore's cheeks turned red. Heavens, this is so embarrassing. You were peeping. Ning Xuemore reprimanded him. She hurriedly put on her clothes. The other side was silent for a while before he replied, No, I was peeping. Ning Xuemore was speechless. If you want to dance like that, you can dance for me when I get back. I can be your audience. Shinjoli's voice was unhurried. Ning Xuemore was speechless. God, come and strike me with lightning. Ning Xuemore's face was so hot that it could boil an egg. She quickly straightened the buttons on her clothes and looked around with lingering fear. She seemed to see his eyes staring at her from somewhere in the dark. She was obviously very embarrassed and angry, but her heart, which was originally somewhat anxious, finally calmed down. It turned out that he had been here all along and didn't just abandon her like that. Thinking that he was watching her from some unknown corner, Ning Xuemore's face once again heated up. She coughed and spoke as if she was speaking to the air or to the person hiding in the darkness. Big sister is going to cultivate. I must break through to the 9th level of the human level today. She flipped her hair handsomely and flashed a charming smile. Only then did she turn around and run off to practice her martial arts. On the lotus platform, Shinjoli swallowed a mouthful of blood. He had recovered a little, but after seeing her sexy dance, his qi and blood were unstable. If he did not go into seclusion for 4 to 5 days, his body would not be able to take it and it would not be easy for him to recover. Fortunately, he had made all the arrangements for her. Her skills were improving rapidly. Everything was going according to his plan. He could finally go into seclusion without worry. He pondered for a while and took out a black directed audio spell. Ning Xuemore thought that Shinjoli would come back at night. She waited until midnight and did not see him. If he did not come back, she could not sleep on the bed and could only sleep on the futon. Maybe he was cultivating too? After all, he was severely injured. The castle at night was magnificent, but Ning Xuemore felt a little lonely. She was lost in thought for a moment, and then decided to meditate on the praying mat. The time spent cultivating seemed long and short. When she opened her eyes again, the sky was already bright. Suddenly, she smelled the aroma of food. Her heart skipped a beat and she ran out. Great God! Outside, the waves of the lake gently lapped against the embankment. There was no one there. Only the small pot was still steaming. This time, there was a bowl of porridge in the small pot. There were unknown flower petals in the porridge, and they were abnormally bright. There was a letter beside it. She didn't know why, but she felt a faint sense of disappointment in her heart, and also wanted to laugh. What was this person doing? Acting as Miss Conch. She took out the letter and looked at it. Written on it were the cultivation techniques she needed to cultivate for the next 3 days. This was his habit. It was very refined. Ning Xuemore slowly scooped out the porridge and drank it. This time, the porridge tasted very good. There was a faint sweetness in the porridge. It was a taste she had never tasted before. This porridge was delicious, but she felt that something was not right. After drinking a bowl, she did not want to drink anymore. She smiled at the air. Hey, great God, thank you for the porridge. Although he did not appear, Xuemore was a little disappointed, but she did not take it to heart. The most important thing for her now was to cultivate. He had also left her a guide, so she just needed to work hard. Chapter 794. She had to admit that the Great God's guide was like a cheat. In addition, the food he sent to her was obviously not ordinary food. Her cultivation was really like a sesame seed blooming. At night, she finally broke through another level, Earth Stage Level 1. She was overjoyed and simply ran to the lake and shouted, "I'm Earth Stage now. Great God, I'm Earth Stage now. Just wait for me to take you as my disciple." Haha, she was finally close to not having to find the Great God to get in through the back door. She could openly join the ranks of the Emperor's disciple. Her voice spread far and wide across the lake. It spread to the depths of the Buddha lotus. On the lotus platform, a snowy figure slowly appeared. His snowy clothes were like mist, almost dyeing the night sky. The silver mask on his face flashed with a cold luster under the moonlight. He heard the shouts coming from afar. His pair of eyes that were as dark as the night faintly flashed as he looked in Ning Xuemore's direction. His eyes flashed with a touch of darkness, and his fingers under the wide sleeves slightly clenched. Another 3 days passed. In these 3 days, Shenjiuli did not appear even once, but Ning Xuemore could see the same food he sent to her every day. It was different every day, but its effect was very helpful to her daily cultivation. After entering the Earth stage, Ning Xuemore realized how difficult it was to increase one level. It was like playing a game. When one's level was low, it was easy to level up, and one could level up many times in a day. But the higher the level, the harder it was to level up. If an example had to be given, it would be that human stage level 8 to level 9 required 100,000 experience points, but after Earth stage level 1 to level 2 required more than 1 million experience point. It was more than 10 times more difficult. In these 3 days, she cultivated day and night according to the instructions given to her. On the last day, she barely broke through Earth stage level 2. She was so tired that she almost vomited blood. Early in the morning of the 3rd day, she finished cultivating and opened the door. A paper crane bumped into her arms. Playing the messenger pigeon game again? Ning Xuemore opened the paper crane. There were only 2 cold words on it: leave. The words were written like dragons flying and phoenixes flying. Ning Xuemore paused for a moment, and finally remembered that today was the day of the competition between the new disciples of the Sun Moon sect. He wanted her to leave because he wanted her to participate in the competition, right? She turned around and looked at the cloud bed. When she came here a few days ago, the scene of her sharing a bed with him on the cloud bed flashed through her mind. From the moment she chose to be his disciple instead of his concubine, he seemed to have left to avoid arousing suspicion. However, the cultivation tutorial that he gave her was indeed excellent. According to what he said, she would be able to achieve twice the result with half the effort. He was indeed the best master he could ever ask for. It seemed like she had made the right decision. Ning Xuemore inwardly sucked in a breath of air. She once again surveyed the surroundings before turning around to leave. It was cold and cheerless outside, just like in the past. She was alone. Speaking of which, weren't those jellyfish only venerable sovereigns able to walk? Then how was she going to leave? Perhaps the ancestor had left a path for her. Ning Xuemore looked around and finally found a long thread that was not much thicker than a strand of hair in an extremely remote direction. That long thread was transparent under the sunlight and hung 3 meters above the ground. If Ning Xuemore had not reached Earth Stage Level 2, she would not have been able to see it. One end of this thread was connected to the pillar of the jellyfish castle, and the other end stretched far away. Chapter 795. Could it be that this was the exit that he had prepared for her? Ning Xuemore flew up as light as a feather. She used her shoe to touch the thread and tested its flexibility. The thread's flexibility was extremely high. It could support the weight of 2 people without any problem. She was still worried, so she walked back and forth a few more steps. The string swayed along with her footsteps, but it didn't seem like it was going to break. It seemed that this was really the exit. She really had to leave this place. Ning Xuemore walked around the castle twice. After living here for a few days, she was actually reluctant to leave. Fortunately, Shinjoli had promised her that he would bring her here again in the future, so she did not have any regrets. She first contacted the little Chiline. This time, the little Chiline responded very quickly. It was still in the Wolf Soul Forest. When it heard Ning Xuemore's call, it no longer cared about peeking with the Wolf King. In a flash, it dashed to the shore of Buddha Lotus Lake. "Master, Master, have you come out yet?" That passionate call made Ning Xuemore's heart warm. "Wait, I'll go out now." Ning Xuemore flew up and stepped on the thin line. Following the line, she dashed forward. She was dressed in pink and glided on the thin line in the air. Her posture was beautiful, but it was also extremely dangerous. This was even more difficult than walking on a tightrope. The tightrope was taut in the air and did not sway too much. However, this thin thread was floating in the air. Especially since the lake was wide and the wind was not small, the thin thread swayed like a swing. An acrobat would at least have a safety rope when walking on a tightrope, but Ning Xuemore did not have any protective equipment on her. Below her was the beautiful Buddha Lotus Lake that could kill people without leaving a trace. If she lost her footing and fell, she would probably melt into the water and not even her bones could be found. If her mental strength was not strong enough, even if she reached Earth Rank Level 3, she might not be able to walk on this path. However, Ning Xuemore held back her anger. She treated this as another test from Shinjoli. She had encountered a few dangerous situations along the way. For example, she had almost fallen down, but she had managed to use her feet to hook onto the thin line and get back up again. Finally, she stepped on this thin line and flew across more than half of Buddha Lotus Lake, getting closer and closer to the opposite shore. From afar, she saw a figure in white standing by the lakeside. Ancestor. Before she could see his face clearly, she saw the white jade mask on his face. The little Chiline was standing far away on the side, anxiously looking at the lake. It saw Ning Xuemore flying over, her sleeves fluttering as if she was flying. It was so happy that it shouted, "Master, here, here." The ancestor coldly glanced at it. "Shut up." Kirin shuddered and tucked its tail between its legs. This time, the ancestor's cold aura seemed to be more than enough. Ning Xuemore glided very quickly on the rope. In the blink of an eye, she reached the shore. Her figure rose and jumped down from the rope, landing not far from the ancestor. She smiled and waved her sleeve. Great God! She was in high spirits and looked at the ancestor with a pair of sparkling black eyes, as if she was waiting for his praise. The ancestor's eyes flashed and looked at her from head to toe. Ning Xuemore suddenly shuddered. The ancestor's eyes were cold. Moreover, It was the kind of eyes that were cold and ruthless to the bone. This gaze made her feel as if a basin of ice water had been poured on her head. Half of the excitement of seeing him ran away. Take this as the first test I'm giving you. Remember, if you don't leave this place by 7 o'clock in the morning, you'll automatically forfeit your right to compete. Before he finished speaking, he had already disappeared into the fog. Ning Xuemore was speechless. Karine was anxious. Hey, we can't break out of here. You have to take us out. Karine's voice was muffled and buzzing in the fog. It seemed that the fog had a suppressive effect, so its voice didn't travel very far. Of course, after Karine's cry, the ancestor didn't return. The only thing around them was the fog, which made it impossible for them to see clearly. Even the trees in the fog couldn't be seen clearly, and only a few branches could be seen occasionally. They looked like strange snakes spreading in the fog. Chapter 797. Maze Mirage. This should be the maze mirage that even Yi Qinghuan couldn't break out of. When Yi Qinghuan became his disciple, she had Earth Stage Level 3 psychokinesis. This was the weakest that he said, and he needed to personally bring her out. Now Ning Xuemore was only Earth Stage Level 2, and she cultivated urgently. Her actual power should be much lower than Yi Qinghuan's at that time. But Di Zun left her here. It was already Yinsha, which meant that she still had 4 hours. 4 hours for her to break through such a difficult situation? He really thought highly of her. Little Apple, have you been here these past few days? Ning Xuemore took a deep breath and stabilized her mind. Since it was called Maze Mirage, there must be some kind of array. She was good at breaking arrays, so she should be able to break out. In order to save time, she had to understand what other people knew first. This way, she could save a lot of detours. Master, I have been wandering around here for a few days, trying to find a way out, but I can't find it. There seems to be a lot of paths here, but no matter which path you take, you'll end up back at the same place. Not only that, along the way, there are all kinds of monsters that come in waves. It's very annoying. I have a few wounds on my body because of one of the monsters here. Ning Xuemore had already seen the 2 intersecting scars on Karine's back. The flesh was rolled up, as if it was torn apart by an animal with sharp teeth and claws. It looked very dangerous. When she met the little Chiline earlier, she had treated it without batting an eyelid. Now, there were already signs of recovery. What kind of animal is that? Are there many of them? Many. Every time there are 7 or 8 of them. Those things look very strange. They have the head of a tiger, the body of a leopard, and the claws of a lion. They move like the wind and are as fast as lightning. It is impossible to guard against them. Every time I meet them, I can only run away. I can only get rid of them by hiding at Buddha Lotus Lake. Karine told her everything it knew. It was very worried. Master, we can't get out by ourselves. Before it finished speaking, a long and sharp whistle came from the depths of the fog. Karine's scales exploded. They are here. That's them. The thick fog in front of them surged like waves, and a few beams of golden light flickered within the thick fog. Karine suddenly stood in front of Ning Xuemore in a protective posture. 8 heads. These were their eyes. Master, run. I'll cover you. Before it could finish its sentence, it felt a breeze on its back, and a figure pounced toward the golden lights. Little Apple, sometimes you have to charge forward, you can't retreat. These were the words Ning Xuemore left for Karine. The roars of the monster and Ning Xuemore's shouts resounded in the thick fog. The fog seemed to be stirred up by some kind of whirlwind, rolling madly. He had to charge forward and could not retreat. Karine was struck by these words. It was stunned for a moment. Then, with a roar, it charged at the monsters. All kinds of roars and sounds of fighting could be heard from the thick fog. About 15 minutes later, the sounds of fighting finally disappeared. Karine looked at the scattered corpses of the monsters and looked at Ning Xuemore with admiration in its eyes. So cool. Its master was so cool. Karine knew how powerful these monsters were. Their bodies were made of copper and iron, and normal attacks could not hurt them at all. Moreover, They also knew earth element spells. Coupled with their fast movements, they had once made Kirene suffer a lot. Chapter 798. The power of one of these monsters was equivalent to an Earth Stage Level 1 cultivator. When these monsters attacked together, their power and destructive power could not be underestimated. Even an Earth Stage Level 4 cultivator would have to fight for a long time against these monsters. They might even be injured a few times before winning. But its master was only an Earth Stage Level 2 cultivator, yet she could easily deal with them. In a short period of time, she used all of her power. Coupled with her crafty footwork, her movements were like a phantom. Every strike was like thunder, and every strike would definitely cause a monster to fall. All of the monsters fell to the ground. Ning Shuamore floated in the air. Her red dress was especially eye-catching in the white fog. In her palm was an emerald green long sword, with drops of blood slowly dripping from the tip of the sword. At this time, she had an unprecedented domineering and sharp aura. To have such a master, Kirene only had one word in its heart: pride. It suddenly felt its blood boil. "Master, we will definitely be able to break out." Ning Shuamore smiled. Yes, she also believed in it. She immediately began to study this maze illusion array and brought the little Cheline into the thick fog. Kirene was right. There were many monsters hidden in the fog. There were all kinds of monsters, and they would jump out to attack from time to time. Moreover, their power and abilities were getting stronger and stronger. Ning Shuamore and Kirene dealt with wave after wave. They gradually became tired and forced. Fortunately, Ning Shuamore's sense of direction was very strong. She also knew how to break all kinds of arrays, so they did not take any detours. Unlike Kirene, they did not take a detour back. In the battle with the monsters, Ning Shuamore was injured. Her arm was pierced by the fangs of a monster that looked like a bear. Blood dyed her entire sleeve. Of course, that bear did not have it easy either. She hit its weak point and it was split in half. Kirene was also injured. There were several crisscrossing wounds on his body. Although the depth of the wounds were different, each wound was bleeding. The most serious wound was so serious that the white bone could be seen under the muscles. Bloody battle. It was truly a bloody battle. Every minute and every second, she and Kirene were racing against death, side by side with the god of death. As for the sovereign, he didn't show up again. After killing this group of ferocious monsters, Ning Shuamore began to quickly treat her and Kirene's wounds. Kirene looked at her bloody sleeve and felt both distressed and angry. Finally, he couldn't help but say, "Ancestor is really cold. To think that you risked your life to save him. How dare he treat us like this? Does he really want us to die?" Ning Shuamore's fingers, which were bandaging her wound, paused for a moment. Her face was a little pale. She pursed her thin lips and said, "It was a test." She could only explain it in this way, even though she almost didn't believe it herself. The gentleness in the Castle of Dreams was like a dream, dissipating as soon as he came out. He had returned to being the cold-blooded and heartless sovereign. Was this his revenge for her not wanting to be his concubine? Or perhaps he really didn't want to accept him as a disciple? A test. He wanted her to risk her life to test him? No. There seemed to be something wrong. The sovereign that appeared this time seemed to be different from the one she usually saw. Ning Shuamore suddenly clenched her fists and transmitted her voice to Kirene. "Do you feel that the sovereign has changed? It's like a different person?" Chapter 799. Kirene was stunned. He thought for a moment and nodded. "Yes, a little. I thought he had some human feelings before, but after recovering from his injury, he didn't even have any. His aura is also cold, so cold that it makes people shiver." He remembered that he had heard his master's call and rushed out of the dark forest. When he suddenly saw the ancestor standing by the lake, he was overjoyed and ran over to greet him. "Ancestor, have you recovered from your injury?" He thought that with the ancestor's attitude towards him and his master these days, he would at least reply. Unexpectedly, he just glanced at him coldly. This glance was as cold as ice and almost froze Kirene's heart. Animals were the most sensitive, especially Kirene. When he saw the ancestor like this, he automatically moved away from him. Master, did you offend him when you were healing? This was the only thing Kirin could think of. Ning Xuemore shook her head slightly. Her last conversation with him could not be considered as offending him. She suddenly thought of a problem. When the ancestor disguised himself as Han Shanyu and accompanied her, it seemed that the ancestor went to Blue Sea Country and was a guest there. Because of this, she ruled out the idea that Han Shanyu was the ancestor. Now that she had confirmed that the ancestor was Han Shanyu, who was the ancestor who went to Blue Sea Country as a guest? The ancestor's substitute. Ning Xuemore once again thought of the ancestor she saw in Chang Kong Country's imperial palace. The ancestor had almost frozen her into a lump of ice. He was emotionless and had no desires. Even in the summer, he could still make people shiver. If she got closer, she would be frostbitten by him. That ancestor and the ancestor who appeared this time were very similar in temperament, as if they were the same person, but there were some differences between him and the ancestor who was healing in the dream castle. Could there really be two ancestors? Generally, it was not too surprising for a super big shot to make a substitute to confuse the public. The ancestor was probably the same, so it was reasonable for him to make a substitute. Then there was the question. Which of these two ancestors was the real one? Which one was the substitute? The one who transformed into Shinjoli and repeatedly entangled with her, the one who took liberties with her on the White Tower, the one who fell into the dark forest with her and got injured, the one who healed with her in the Castle of Dreams. All of these should be the same person, Shinjoli, the name that made her feel familiar and intimate, Shinjoli. And the person who appeared in the vast Sky Country's imperial palace, as well as the person who was treating her like a stranger, should be another person. Although his aura was also very strong and even colder than Shinjoli's, Ning Xuemore still felt that his aura was not as strong as Shinjoli's. Shinjoli's strength came from his bones, but this venerable sovereign's strength was more like a deliberate act. They gave Ning Xuemore the feeling that they were authentic and high-quality imitations. No matter how good the imitation was, in the eyes of people who were familiar with the brand, it was still a fake. They couldn't compare to him either. Then, if she guessed correctly, Shinjoli should be the ancestor. This person should be a substitute. Moreover, this substitute was also not simple. Whether it was martial arts or intelligence, it must be extremely profound. Originally, she and the ancestor accidentally fell into this place, but now the ancestor disappeared and the substitute appeared. Was this substitute summoned by the ancestor, or did it appear on its own? Why did the ancestor disappear inexplicably? Ning Xuemore thought of Shinjoli's injuries and his actual weakness. Did something happen to Shinjoli? Chapter 800. Ning Xuemore felt as if a fire was burning in her heart. Countless thoughts spun around in her mind. She took a deep breath and sent these messy thoughts away. Now was not the time to think about these things. She had to get out first. Only when she got out could she find out the truth. She shook her head. Stop talking nonsense and save your energy. Let's go. They had already killed 5 waves of monsters. If her calculations were correct, there should be another wave of monsters waiting for her. Moreover, it was a big boss. After defeating the boss, they should be at the exit. Ning Xuemore calculated the time in her heart. More than 2 hours had passed. She had to move faster. She didn't have to become Di Zun's disciple, but she wanted to prove herself. She longed for an absolute victory. After walking for a while, the thick fog in front of them suddenly turned black. The surrounding air instantly became cold, and the ground beneath their feet shook. A gloomy and cold air came from the black fog. An extremely dull roar that could make one's soul tremble could be heard. Ning Xuemore gripped the hilt of her sword tightly. She knew that the final big boss was about to appear. She could either kill it and get out, or she and Kirin would die in its hands. There was no third choice. When enemies met on a narrow path, the brave would win. She was going to fight. A huge monster that was like a mountain slowly appeared in the thick fog. A waterfall hung outside the green mountains. An ink peak was hidden among the green bamboos. A waterfall, a bamboo forest, and an ink peak. Below the ink peak, beside the waterfall, was an open field. There were 30 young men and women standing on the field. All of them were between 13 and 14 years old. Some were handsome, some were elegant, some were cold and arrogant, and some were in high spirits. Although there was still a hint of childishness in their eyes, they were like treasured swords that had just been unsheathed. There was a hint of sharpness in their eyes. These people were the Sun-Moon sect's primary disciples who had just been selected. They came from different countries and different places. These people were all geniuses in their countries. Their talents were astonishing, and they were crowned with the title of Heaven's Pride. They were the elites of the elites, the best of the best. They were all people who were cherished and nurtured by the local people or officials. It was inevitable that they would have an air of arrogance and a domineering air about them. They had already been here for 10 days. Although they had yet to officially compete, they had already experienced both open and covert competition in private. The winner beamed with joy while the loser remained silent. Gradually, they were divided into different grades and ranks. Among these people, there were 2 outstanding figures who were most likely to be accepted as Di Zun's disciples. A young man and a young woman. The young girl's name was Feng Jiasin. She came from the Fengyi country and didn't come from a high family. Her parents were commoners and she was born with metal and earth spiritual roots. The metal spiritual root was the main spiritual root and the earth spiritual root was the secondary spiritual root. There were many people who had dual spirit roots, but very few of them had dual spirit roots that coexisted with each other. Especially since she possessed 2 pure spiritual roots. At such a young age, his metal spirit root had already reached Earth rank level 5, and his earth spirit root had also reached Earth rank level 2. When she was 5 years old, her extremely high talent was discovered. When she was 10 years old, the Empress of the Fengyi country took her into the imperial palace and adopted her. She was born young, and the Empress bestowed upon her the imperial surname of Feng. She was also sent a psychokinesis master to teach and nurture her. Her food and clothing were even more high-end than those of a real princess of the Fengyi country. It was also because of her that her parents and clansmen ascended to the heavens with her, each receiving a reward from the Empress. The waterfall danced like a silver dragon, pouring into the deep pool below. Above the deep pool, there was an iron chain that stretched across the 2 mountains. The iron chain was only as thick as a little finger, and it swayed in the air. These disciples first madly spun around 100 times on the ground, and after they were done, they immediately had to walk down the thin iron chain. They did not have any protective measures on their bodies. Once they fell, they would fall into the deep pool below. In the deep pool, there was a flood dragon beast. Its 2 blood-red eyes were wide open, and its mouth was wide open as it glared at every disciple who passed by on the iron chain. They would form a group of 2 so that they could look after each other. Of course, they could also kick each other's feet to reduce the number of competitors. This was a test of one's courage. More than half of the test was done. 3 of the disciples who participated in the test fell into the deep pool and were swallowed by the flood dragon. The crunching sound of chewing scared the other 2 participants so much that they immediately gave up. Chapter 802. Coincidentally, through drawing lots, Feng Jiasin and Helian Xiao were in the same group. With their abilities, it should be easy for them to cross the iron chain. They didn't need to work together. The moment she knew they were in the same group, Feng Jiasin approached Helian Xiao. "Prince Helian, I want to discuss something with you." Her voice was tender and soft. Helian Xiao had a straightforward and bright temperament. "Just say it." Feng Jiasin pursed her lips slightly. "I know Prince Helian wants to compete with me for the position of Di Zun's disciple. Prince Helian sees me as a rival, right?" Helian Xiao was indeed straightforward. He straightforwardly admitted, "That's right. You're my only rival." Feng Jiasin bit her lips again. "We came here to join Sun-Moon sect and bring glory to our family, not to risk our lives. My parents are already old. You know, it's not easy for a commoner family to produce a talented person. They love me like a pearl. If something happens to me, they probably won't be able to live." Helian Xiao knew Feng Jussin's background. It was indeed not easy for a commoner girl to reach this step. What's more, she usually treated people peacefully and amiably. Unlike him, he was born with the temperament of a young master. His popularity was not as good as Feng Jussin's. Every time Feng Jussin saw him, she would call him Prince Helian Xiao left and right. She was very polite. In addition to her talent, Helian Xiao's impression of her was quite good. Hearing her words, he frowned. I don't like to beat around the bush. If you have something to say, just say it. Feng Jussin sighed and said, with our abilities, it should be easy to cross this iron chain. However, under the condition that we're not being plotted against, once we're plotted against, we might lose our lives. So I want to ask Prince Helian Xiao for one thing. When we go up later, can we not plot against each other? Helian Xiao's expression changed abruptly. He raised his eyebrows and said, what kind of person do you think I am? How can I plot against my companions? Even if I want to compete with you, I'll compete openly. Feng Jussin's brows relaxed and she smiled slightly. Thank you, Prince Helian Xiao. When we go up later, can I ask Prince Helian Xiao to walk in front? Helian Xiao knew that she was still on guard against him. He felt somewhat uncomfortable in his heart, but he didn't want to bicker with a girl. He nodded his head. Why not? This young master will walk in front. He raised his head and looked at the iron chain. The iron chain was about 200 to 300 feet long. With his ability, he could rush over in the blink of an eye. Without Feng Jussin in front of him, he could run faster. While they were talking, it was their turn to go on stage. After the two of them circled around 100 times, they looked at each other and stepped onto the iron chain one after another. Helian Xiao was in the front while Feng Jussin was at the back. These two people's appearances were undoubtedly top-notch. At this moment, they were standing on the swaying iron chain. The man was like a jade tree in the wind, and the woman was like a flower in the water. Nothing more beautiful could be imagined. After Helian Xiao stepped onto the iron chain, he slowed down a few steps. After getting used to it, he clenched his fingers and sprinted forward. Unexpectedly, Feng Jussin's movements were not slow either. She followed closely behind him. In the blink of an eye, the two people walked to the middle of the iron chain. Below them was the deep pool. The ferocious flood dragon was looking at them with its mouth wide open. And it was at this moment that a sudden change happened. Helian Xiao was in the middle of sprinting when a large rock suddenly appeared on the iron chain under his feet. He was caught off guard and couldn't stop in time. He was tripped by the large rock and fell down. Chapter 803. Fortunately, Helian Xiao's reaction was very fast. Once he saw that the situation was bad, he flipped in the air and a green vine flew out from his palm and wrapped around the iron chain. He leaped up and wanted to take advantage of the momentum to jump onto the iron chain again. Prince, I'm sorry. When he was in the air, he saw that the plain-clothed girl was still on the iron chain. A golden light flashed from her palm and directly cut off the green vine that saved his life. Damn it! I've been tricked by her. Helian Xiao was furious, but his body was in the air and he couldn't borrow any strength. He could only watch helplessly as his body fell. There was nothing he could do. He didn't expect that he would die here today. He didn't expect that he, Helian Xiao, would become the food of this ferocious flood dragon. Before he could finish his thought, a green light suddenly wrapped around his waist. That green light suddenly pulled him and his body flew into the air like a swing. Naturally, he wouldn't let go of this rare chance to survive. He flipped in the air and finally landed on the iron chain again. Just as he stood still, his waist was released and that green light shrunk back like lightning. Helian Xiao was still in a state of shock and looked towards the direction of the green light. He was suddenly stunned. On the platform of the mountain that was connected to the iron chain stood a red-clothed girl. That girl looked to be about 14 or 15 years old. Her red clothes fluttered in the wind like fire. Beside her, there was a bloody ferocious beast with a pair of large eyes that flashed with a frightening cold light. This girl and beast seemed to have appeared out of thin air on the mountain's wall. No one present recognized them. Naturally, They were Ning Shuemore and Kirin, who had rushed out of the maze illusion realm. Shuemore and Kirin had just experienced a fierce battle with the final big boss that appeared. This big boss monster was abnormally ferocious. If they only relied on their actual abilities, 2 Ning Shuemore and 2 Kirin wouldn't be its match. Fortunately, Ning Shuemore's battle experience was not ordinary. She also had a special footwork and many clever ideas. After fighting with the monster for almost 2 hours, she paid the price of her left leg being heavily injured and joined forces with Kirin to finally kill the monster. She understood that the monsters in this illusion realm were endless and would be reborn in a cycle. If she was one step slower, the exit would close again and the big boss monster that she had just killed would revive. She didn't have the ability to kill it a second time. Ning Shuemore's left leg had been pierced by the monster's claw, and there were several deep and shallow wounds on her body. Blood flowed all over her body, but she didn't bother to clean it up. The moment the monster fell to the ground and the exit appeared, she brought the little Chiline with her and flew out. What she didn't realize that as soon as she and Kirin flew out, the hole closed. A persona white-clothed man appeared from the thick fog. The jade mask on his face flashed with an ice-cold luster. He looked at the hole Ning Shuemore had escaped from, and a complicated light flashed through his eyes. Xiao xiao xiao. Xiao was Hellion Xiao. I xiao xiao xiao. Xiao 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 xiao. The hill-like monster that Ning Shuemore had just killed appeared on the spot. When it saw the Queen of the Maze Illusion Realm, it immediately roared and pounced on the Queen of the Maze Illusion Realm. The Queen of the Maze Illusion Realm didn't dodge. She frowned slightly and raised her finger. A white light enveloped the monster. The monster's body trembled and was instantly frozen, turning into an ice sculpture. The Queen of the Maze Illusion Realm flicked her finger again. The ice sculpture instantly shattered into powder and disappeared without a trace. Chapter 804. The monster that Ning Shuemore had been fighting for almost 2 hours couldn't even last half a move against him. He got rid of it with just a wave of his hand. He lowered his eyes slightly for a moment before walking out of the hole that had opened up once again. Ning Shuemore had just jumped out of the cave. Before she could see what was going on around her, she saw a man falling down from the iron chain and a fierce dragon waiting for him with its mouth wide open. Almost subconsciously, she waved her hand to release the green rope to wrap around the man and threw him up, saving his life. Naturally, she heard all kinds of low cries coming from below. Looking down, she saw a dense crowd of people. Countless faces were looking up in her direction. Because the mountain was very high, Ning Shuemore couldn't see the faces of those people clearly. She only vaguely felt that they were children, 12 or 13 years old. With a gust of wind, the young man who had just fallen on the iron chain rushed towards her like a whirlwind. He was already in front of Ning Shuemore. His momentum was so strong that Ning Shuemore calmly took a step back. The young man bowed to her. "Thank you for your help, miss." His eyes flashed as he looked her up and down. He frowned. "You're injured. Quickly bandage it." Before his voice died away, he had already held 4 or 5 small medicine bottles in front of Ning Shuemore. "This is the heavenly spirit pill, Jinchuang medicine." Ning Shuemore was speechless. Only now did she realize that the wounds on her body were painful. She was a doctor, so she naturally knew the value of medicine. She knew that the young man in front of her was holding good medicine for treating external injuries. However, she didn't need these now. Ning Shuemore carried all kinds of medicine given to her by the ancestor. After the ancestor woke up from his coma, he probably realized that Shuemore wouldn't be able to survive without medicine, so he prepared a few bottles for her in case she needed them. When he and Ning Shuemore met for the last time, he even put her treasures in a Chenkuan bag and gave them to her. She had just walked out of a dangerous hand-to-hand fight. Her body was full of murderous intent, and she was subconsciously on guard against people. She shook her head. "No need, I have my own medicine." Just as she said this, her body swayed. She was exhausted and had lost too much blood, so she could barely hold on. "Be careful." Hellion Xiao couldn't help but reach out to support her. "Be careful." Kirin also rushed over and knocked the young man away. She used her body to catch Ning Shuemore, who had fallen to the ground. Helian Xiao was almost knocked off the platform by Kirin. He hurriedly held onto a stake to stabilize himself. Just as he was about to say something, a white light suddenly flashed on the mountain wall. A white-clothed person appeared out of thin air and stood on the platform. The wide white robe, the ice jade mask, the ink-black eyes, the long hair that draped over his shoulders, the aura that was as cold as snow and incomparably powerful. There was no one else who had this kind of temperament and this kind of dressing. Although Helian Xiao had never seen an ancestor before, he had at least heard of him. As soon as he saw the white-robed man's attire, he immediately recognized him. Overjoyed, he immediately bent over and knelt down. Ancestor. Ning Xuemore also leaned on Kirin and slowly turned her head. Her gaze fell on the person who had a cold temperament and was used to being high and mighty. The corners of her lips curled up slightly. It turned out that he didn't come out early. He had been following behind her all along. It seemed that he didn't want her to die. She raised her head to look at the sun in the sky and smiled. Ancestor, it's just right now. Xuemore didn't miss the time. Asking for all kinds of tickets. Chapter 805. The ancestor looked down at her, but didn't say anything. Instead, he sent a message to the disciples kneeling below. Feng Lianyi, from now on, this Ning Xuemore will also join them and compete with them. The disciple in charge of teaching these new talents was called Feng Lianyi. He was Yalu Jing'an's disciple. His character was quite similar to his master's. He was gentle like jade and patient with people. The training of the new disciples was basically led by him. He was lucky enough to see the ancestor twice, so he recognized him. Just now, when he saw the ancestor appear, he had already led everyone to kneel down. Hearing this command from afar, he hurriedly responded with a loud yes. Feng Lianyi was bewildered. The ancestor never asked about the Sun-Moon sect's recruitment of new disciples, nor did he interfere. Why did he personally send someone here this time? Did the ancestor need special care for the person sent here? He wasn't the only one who had this thought. Everyone present also had this thought. Especially Feng Jiaxin. She had just plotted against Helian Xiao and thought she had finally kicked off a strong opponent. She didn't expect that Ning Xuemore would appear midway. And the ancestor had personally sent her. Could it be that the ancestor's disciple had already been decided? Her charming face turned green and white. Her small hands clenched into fists inside her sleeves. Just as everyone had this thought, the ancestor's voice sounded again. This time, every word was very clear. She is no different from the other participating disciples here. Treat her the same way you treat others. This time, I will only accept the strongest disciple. Everyone, work hard. The meaning of these words was very clear. That was, there was no need to take care of Ning Xuemore in any way. If she wanted to enter the Sun-Moon sect, she had to participate in various tests. The ancestor wouldn't show any favoritism. Feng Jiaxin secretly let out a sigh of relief. She boldly asked, Ancestor, this disciple has a matter to ask. Speak. We've already gone through 6 rounds of various tests and eliminated a portion of people. Does this Miss Ning also have to go through those tests to be fair? The malice in her words was very obvious. Di Zun glanced at Ning Xuemore, whose face was pale due to excessive blood loss. What do you say? Before Ning Xuemore could say anything, Helian Xiao, who was kneeling at the side, hastily opened his mouth, reporting to the venerable sovereign, the first 6 tests were extremely exhausting. Moreover, each test was completed within 3 days. Everyone has time to rest, and Miss Ning is seriously injured. I'm afraid it's not appropriate for her to go through those 6 stages. Although Ning Xuemore didn't know what the 6 stages were, from their words, she knew that they must be very dangerous and not easy to pass. She raised her head and stared at the ancestor's face with her big eyes. The corners of her lips curled up slightly. What does the ancestor intend to do? She wanted to see what this person wanted. The ancestor's voice was indifferent. Since you want to be my disciple, you naturally have to experience things that ordinary people can't. You can't ask for special treatment from me, unless you give up on the idea of becoming my disciple. So he was forcing her to give up. Ning Xuemore smiled. I've never asked for special treatment from you. I'll just go through those 6 stages. She slowly straightened her body. Suddenly, she staggered and fell forward. The ancestor was standing right in front of her and was completely unprepared. He was hit by her. His eyes suddenly turned cold. Just as he was about to make a move, he suddenly thought of something. His palm that was about to send her flying paused. Just as he was hesitating, Ning Xuemore got up like lightning and jumped away from his embrace. Chapter 806. I'm sorry, I tripped. Ning Xuemore lowered her eyes and apologized. Di Zun was speechless. His snow-white sleeve was stained with her blood, which was dazzling red. His body was cold. Although there was a faint fragrance, which was very similar to Shenjiuli's, Ning Xuemore could still distinguish the difference. Shenjiuli's fragrance was naturally present, but the fragrance on the person in front of her was applied later. They were really not the same person. The person in front of her was really not him. Ning Xuemore's mood was very agitated. She was only suspicious before and didn't dare to be sure. Now, she was completely sure. Although she still couldn't figure out what was going on, as long as she was sure that the person in front of her was not him, it was enough. She believed that he had no choice but to leave. She believed that he would come back. She believed that Shenjiuli wanted to accept her as his disciple. If the real him was here, he wouldn't bear to let her get hurt, and he wouldn't let her risk her life in the maze mirage. Since that was the case, she couldn't let him be criticized by others and leave a topic for others to talk about. She would rely on her own ability to stay. Her gaze fell on the Di Zun in front of her. She knew that she absolutely couldn't expose this matter now. The real Di Zun wasn't here. Even if she exposed his identity now, no one would believe her. Moreover, she might even anger the person in front of her and kill her. Di Zun, Xuemore can fight for the 6 stages, but Xuemore has a condition. She wanted to fight for the biggest rights for herself. Say it. Xuemore has just broken out of the maze mirage and is seriously injured. Please give Xuemore 2 hours to heal. Okay. The Di Zun agreed. Her request wasn't excessive, and he couldn't really force her to die. After 2 hours, I will go to the 6 stages, but other people pass it in 3 days. How much time will you give me? Ning Xuemore continued to ask. The Di Zun obviously knew the process of the 6 stages. He said faintly, your aptitude is ordinary. If you want to be my disciple, you must have outstanding performance in other aspects to convince everyone. In the 6 tests, you will have time to catch your breath, you don't need to rest. I'll give you 12 hours. If you pass all of them within 12 hours, I'll give you a chance. The expression of Helian Xiao, who was standing at the side, changed greatly. He had fought his way through the 6 stages, so he naturally knew how powerful they were. Even for someone of his level, even if he was in his peak condition, he would still need 16 hours to pass through 6 stages at his fastest speed. The premise was that he was made of iron and would not get tired. If one were to encounter a slightly slower person, they would need at least 6 to 8 hours to pass one of the stages. As for Ning Xuemore, it was simply a pipe dream for her to pass the 6 stages while being seriously injured. He was born with a temper that liked to fight for justice. At this moment, he couldn't help but feel indignant for Ning Xuemore. If the other party wasn't a venerable emperor, he was afraid that he would coldly spit back. Now, he couldn't help but tug on Ning Xuemore's sleeve and transmit his voice to her. Don't agree, you won't pass. Ning Xuemore nodded slightly at him, indicating that she knew what she was doing. She tilted her head and looked at the Di Zun. What chance? The Di Zun said, you can pass the 6 stages in 12 hours. This proves that you are indeed a genius. Even if you don't win against the others in the final round and can't be my disciple, you can still be my disciple. You can choose anyone from the Sun-Moon sect. This was indeed not a small temptation. It must be known that among the new disciples, only one person could be the Di Zun's disciple. The others were completely chosen by the guardian elders. Chapter 807. This time, Yelu Jing'an was the most outstanding disciple, and he only accepted one disciple this time. Everyone thought that Yelu Jing'an's disciple would be either Feng Jiaxin or Helian Xiao. They didn't expect that this quota would fall on Ning Xuemo. If she could pass the 6 tests within 12 hours, she could at least become Yelu Jing'an's disciple. It could be considered a blessing in disguise. Of course, the premise was that she could pass the tests within 12 hours. Ning Xuemo slightly lowered her eyes. Then Xuemo will be so bold as to ask again. Has there been anyone who managed to pass the 6th trial within 12 hours? The ancestor only answered her with one word, yes. Since there was, it proved that it could be done by humans. If others could do it, then Ning Xuemo could do it. She was about to answer when Helian Xiao transmitted his voice again. Miss Ning, the one who passed the 6 tests within 12 hours was Prince Qian Xiaoshe from 1,000 years ago. He was the most talented disciple of the ancestor. When he entered the ancestor's tutelage, he was already Earth rank level 6 and had never been surpassed. Ning Xuemo's heart moved. She naturally knew about Prince Qian Xiaoshe. It seemed that the prince sealed in the stone spirit's stomach was him. The ancestor's proudest disciple, who was once a legend of the entire continent, died young. This kind of talent was one of a kind, and he still needed 12 hours to pass the tests. Ning Xuemo was only Earth rank level 2, and the ancestor gave her 12 hours. It was obvious that he was making things difficult for her. The matter of accepting disciples will be decided tomorrow. It will be your real competition. If you want to join them, you must pass all the tests today. If you want to blame someone, blame yourself for coming too late. Of course, you can choose to give up. The ancestor's voice was still indifferent, which meant that he wasn't deliberately making things difficult for her. Ning Xuemo sneered in her heart. This person kept saying that he wasn't making things difficult for her, but in fact, he was always making things difficult for her. She didn't know what kind of deep hatred she had with him that made him treat her like this. She smiled slightly. Ancestor, can you give Xuemo some time to consider? Yes. The ancestor agreed again and added, you should rest for 2 hours and think about it. When the time comes, give the results to Feng Lianyi directly. He will naturally report to me. He turned around and disappeared from where he stood. While Ning Xuemo was talking, she had already treated her wounds quickly. Now, she immediately sat down and meditated to recover. At this point, naturally, no one would think that the ancestor was biased towards Ning Xuemo. He was clearly making things difficult for her. Some people looked at Ning Xuemo with sympathy, while others sighed. Of course, there were also those who wanted to see her as a joke. Feng Lianyi finally came up. He had just seen Ning Xuemo's skills. He knew that although her psyche power was low, her ability to react and perform on the spot was still remarkable. He looked at Ning Xuemo with a slightly complicated gaze. Miss Ning, of the 6 trials, 3 of them are very risky. It also consumed a lot of psyche power. With your current physique, being able to pass the test in 1 day and 1 night is already a miracle, and that's under the condition that there are no accidents. Therefore, it's impossible for you to pass the 12-hour time limit. It's better to give up. If you give up, I can also accept you. His words were sincere, but Ning Xuemo only faintly smiled. She thanked him but did not say anything. Feng Lianyi saw her like this and didn't say anything more. The match had been interrupted halfway through by this sudden incident, so naturally, the match would continue. Helian Xiao's second test was naturally very easy. After he passed, he immediately ran back to Ning Xuemo's side. Chapter 808. When the disciples passed by Ning Xuemo, they would look at her with all kinds of gazes. Pity, ridicule, and indifference. Although they were all geniuses, they were still children after all. Children didn't know how to hide their emotions, so when they looked at Ning Xuemo, the emotions in their eyes were very direct. Even the little Chelin could sense it. This made it very unhappy, very unhappy. It stared back at them one by one. Ning Xuemo didn't care. She learned about the 6 tests from Helian Xiao. From him, she knew that there were 2 literary tests and 4 martial tests. The literary test tested one's memory and comprehension ability in an instant, while the martial test tested a variety of things. The mechanical test was similar to Shaylin's Mu Ren Gang. There were all kinds of things. Helian Xiao had secretly given her a brief explanation. Ning Xuemore finally had a plan in her heart. She wasn't in a hurry to tell Feng Lianyi the final result. Instead, she seized the time to meditate and recover. It had to be said that the medicine Shen Jiuli gave her was excellent. In addition, her psychokinesis had reached the second level of the Earth realm, so her recovery ability was much faster than before. She used the art of rejuvenation several times in succession. After an hour, the wounds on her body had already scabbed over. Her originally pale face also had a little bit of redness. Ning Xuemore had already treated the little Chaline's injuries before she started meditating. The little Chaline recovered even faster. She even went down to the pond to take a bath. It was strange that when the fierce flood dragon below saw Karine, it didn't dodge nor was it afraid. Karine looked at the fierce flood dragon suspiciously. Seeing that it didn't provoke it, it didn't take it to heart. It recovered in the water for a while, and the wounds on its body healed faster. When it came out of the pool and returned to Ning Xuemore's side, exactly an hour had passed. Ning Xuemore stood up and smiled elegantly at Feng Lianyi, who was standing next to her. Please tell Di Zun that I'll bet. Feng Lianyi sighed softly. Naturally, he couldn't stop them. He agreed and sent a message to the venerable sovereign. She actually wanted to challenge 6 stages within 12 hours. Almost everyone present was boiling with excitement. Everyone looked at Ning Xuemore as if she were crazy. They didn't understand where her confidence came from. Helian Xiao looked at Ning Xuemore with a complicated gaze. He wanted to persuade her again. Miss Ning. Ning Xuemore waved her hand, indicating that he didn't need to say anything more. At the side, Feng Jiaxin suddenly sighed faintly. Miss Ning, you're the daughter of Vast Sky Empire's Marquis Ning, right? As soon as he said this, everyone present was shocked. Ning Xuemore had caused a lot of trouble recently. She had already gained a great reputation in Jianghu. Most of the well-informed people on this continent knew about her. The world's #1 trash, the 6th prince broke off the engagement, the crown prince protected her, she was conferred the title of beast concubine, she subdued the extremely rare Chaline beast, the venerable sovereign personally said that she was a 1,000-year lonely phoenix, and she was taken in by Han Shanyu as a concubine. In just a few months, her fate had been up and down, giving the continent a lot of topics to talk about. Of course, the evaluation of her was more negative than positive. There were even some who directly said that she was a disaster, a fox spirit. She didn't have much ability, but her luck was very good, and she was very good at confusing men. Just now, although the venerable sovereign said her name, her title as the world's #1 trash had already been deeply rooted in people's hearts. No one would have thought that such a person could also enter the Sun Moon sect. They naturally wouldn't think that this Ning Xuemore was Ning Xuemore. Chapter 809. Therefore, when Feng Jiaxin said this, all the boys and girls present widened their eyes in shock. Helian Xiao took a step back. You are really Ning Xuemore, the daughter of Marquis Jing Yuan? Ning Xuemore glanced at Feng Jiaxin with her bright eyes. This little girl's little scheme was nothing in her eyes. The reason she exposed Xuemore's identity was to embarrass her, that's all. She smiled. There's only one Ning Xuemore in this world. There's only this one, and no other. This sentence was so domineering. The crowd buzzed again, obviously shocked by her. All kinds of discussions were incessant. A girl couldn't help but say, I remember that Marquis Ning's daughter is a psychokinesis trash. She can't even cultivate psychokinesis. Why is she here? This question was unavoidably sharp. Ning Xuemore lightly smiled. Suddenly, she closed in on her and grabbed her belt with lightning speed. With a whirlwind dance, she threw her out. Her movements were too fast and too urgent. Everyone simply couldn't react, and the girl who was thrown didn't even have time to react. By the time she reacted, she was already in midair. Below her was a deep pool of water. The girl's body fell down, and she was so scared that her soul almost left her body. She screamed involuntarily. Just as she screamed, a green light flashed and wrapped around her waist, forcibly pulling her back. The girl flew back to the platform as if she was riding the clouds. She staggered and almost fell down. A small hand patted her shoulder. "Stand firm." With this back and forth, the girl was so scared that her face turned green. She looked at Ning Xuemore as if she had seen a ghost. She said in a trembling voice, "You." Ning Xuemore was calm and composed. "How does it feel to be saved by a trash after being thrown out?" That girl, Ning Xuemore's display of her small hand simply shocked everyone present. Those whispering about how such a piece of trash had managed to sneak into the Sun-Moon sect automatically stopped all voices of injustice. Ning Xuemore used her actions to give these people who looked down on her and called her a good-for-nothing a slap in the face. Regardless of how strong her psychokinesis was, her speed and her kung fu had already placed her in the ranks of expert. What's more, some of the sharp-eyed people had noticed that the green rope that she had thrown out earlier was a result of her casually condensing the wood element. This kind of skill could only be achieved by someone whose wood psychokinesis had reached Earth rank level 2 or above. In other words, her psychokinesis was definitely not trash. It had already reached Earth rank level 2. An Earth rank level 2 was naturally not eye-catching in the Sun-Moon sect, even if almost all of the newcomers present had a higher psychokinesis value than her. However, she was different. Just a few months ago, she was still a psychic trash that everyone looked down on. To be able to cultivate to such a level in just a few months was simply an inconceivable miracle. With her cultivation speed, wouldn't she be able to surpass everyone present very soon? Everyone looked at her with even more complicated gazes, but this time, it was mostly surprise and worship. Feng Jiaxin's expression changed slightly. She originally didn't put Ning Xuemore in her heart, but now she felt a strong sense of crisis. She didn't expect that this Cheng Yaojin who had jumped out halfway not only saved her opponent, but was also her opponent. Too infuriating. Her fists in her sleeves were clenched tightly. Looking at Ning Xuemore, she suddenly smiled gently. "So it really is Miss Ning. Jiaxin has heard of Miss Ning's great name like thunder." She said a long string of polite words. Chapter 8:10. Feng Jiaxin changed the topic. "A few days ago, I heard that you married Master Han Shanyu as a concubine. It can be said that you have someone to rely on for your whole life. However, coming to the Sun-Moon sect to learn from a master, you can only be a virgin. This is really a pity." Although she said it was a pity, she didn't mean it at all. She was obviously telling everyone that Ning Xuemore was no longer a virgin. She didn't even have the qualifications to enter the Sun-Moon sect, let alone become the disciple of the emperor. Helian Xiao was originally very unhappy because he was schemed against by her just now. At this moment, seeing her expose Ning Xuemore's background, he was even angrier. If he was angry at her unscrupulous means before, now he had already started to despise her character. "Feng Jiaxin, don't go too far." Feng Jiaxin looked innocent. "How am I going too far? I only regret that Miss Ning can't enter the Sun-Moon sect and become a disciple of the same sect as us." Ning Xuemore glanced at Feng Jiaxin. The little girl was very beautiful, with a kind of light and graceful aura. What a pity for such a good appearance. Such a young white lotus and such a high level. She laughed and looked Feng Jiaxin up and down. She said indifferently, "Who are you? Do I know you?" Feng Jiaxin's little face changed slightly. Ning Xuemore's aura was too strong. A short sentence seemed to squeeze out the little in her bones. She couldn't help but raise her head and put on an imposing manner. This princess is Feng Jiaxin. She believed that her name was spread all over the continent, so Ning Xuemore must have heard of her. "Ah, I don't know you." Ning Xuemore answered directly. "Feng Jiaxin." She was choked. Ning Xuemore changed the topic and smiled. "However, I know you now. Just now, the one who schemed against your companion was you, right?" Feng Jiaxin. After all, she felt guilty in her heart. At this time, being exposed in front of everyone, she became angry from embarrassment. What companion? The competition has rules that we can use all kinds of methods to eliminate the opponent, so you can be unscrupulous? You could have pretended to be sympathetic to me, saying that it wasn't easy for a commoner's daughter to climb to this step, that you still have an old mother waiting for you to return home, that you can't die, and that when you discuss with me, we can't scheme against each other. Helian Xiao sneered at the side. Actually, many people had seen Feng Jiaxin plotting against Helian Xiao, but because of the competition's rules, no one felt anything. What they didn't expect was that Feng Jiaxin had begged them to be lenient, but in the end, she went back on her words and schemed against them. This method was too despicable. When everyone looked at Feng Jiaxin again, their gazes were somewhat strange. Feng Jiaxin blushed. I didn't. It's clear that you discussed it with her to say that about me. I know that one of you is the daughter of a marquis and the other is the son of a prince. Looking down on ordinary people like us. Do you think you can join forces to slander a commoner girl like me? She was on the verge of tears. Her eyes were watery and she looked as if she had suffered a great grievance. You. Helian Xiao's handsome face also turned red. This was really a typical drama of the weak bullying the strong. Ning Xuemo sneered slightly. She had obviously done something bad, but she denounced the strong with the identity of the weak, stripping the sympathy of the public, making the strong unable to speak. This girl was very skilled in using this wicked method. It seemed that she had used it more than once. But before they could stop screaming, she landed lightly on the swaying ice chains and continued to run as fast as lightning. A trace of ruthlessness flashed in Feng Jiaxin's eyes. She quietly moved to the side of the iron chain and twisted her finger in her sleeve. A watermelon-sized watermelon SS, a watermelon TTT. Seeing that Ning Xuemo's feet were about to hit that stone, she suddenly did a front flip and flew up again. When she flipped and landed, she didn't know if it was intentional or not, but she kicked that stone. Whoosh! That stone was like a whistling meteor, shooting straight toward Feng Jiaxin. Feng Jiaxin was originally satisfied and waiting to see Ning Xuemo make a fool of herself. She never thought that she would do this. Seeing that the stone was moving so fast, it was difficult for her to dodge it in a graceful manner. Chapter 8:12. In a hurry, Feng Jiaxin's body suddenly leaned back, and with an iron plank bridge, she dodged the whistling stone. But she didn't guard against a sharp stone at the place where she leaned back. Puff! The back of her head was in close contact with the sharp stone. She hit it hard and didn't practice the iron head technique. Therefore, she was in pain. Helian Xiao saw that she was playing tricks again and was furious. He was about to punish her, but he didn't expect that she had already received her retribution. He couldn't help but laugh, harming others and harming yourself. Retribution. Feng Jiaxin saw stars in front of her eyes. After flying for a long time, she came back to her senses and jumped up from the ground. There was a big bruise on the back of her head, almost bursting out of her hair. Her hair was messy and her clothes were scattered. She was in a sorry state. She was ashamed and angry. She couldn't help but look at Feng Lianyi, brother Feng, Ning. Miss Ning definitely did it on purpose. She plotted against me. Feng Lianyi glanced at her coldly, as if he just recognized her today. His voice was slightly cold. You plotted against her first. Did she think he was blind and didn't see her little movements? Feng Jiaxin murmured, Senior brother Feng, you said that when teammates pass, we can use extreme methods. We can work together and plot against each other, so you were plotted against by her. What's there to complain about? Feng Lianyi's voice was even colder. Feng Jiaxin. She was speechless. While they were talking, Ning Xuemo had already glided to the other side. She succeeded. And she succeeded very beautifully. Helian Xiao couldn't help but take the lead to applaud Ning Xuemo. He laughed, Miss Ning, even if I lose to you in the future, I'll be convinced. His voice spread far and wide. After saying that, he looked at Feng Jiaxin with disdain. Feng Jiaxin pursed her lips and lowered her eyes. The final outcome hadn't been decided yet. She would work harder. She could do it. A beautiful genius like her could definitely become the ancestor's disciple and become his second direct female disciple. She wanted to turn the tables. She wanted to let these rich kids see that she, a commoner, could also step on them one day. If she could successfully become the ancestor's disciple, she definitely couldn't forgive these two people who made her a fool of herself. Feng Lianyi could not be let off either. He actually wasn't biased towards a genius like her. She had been pretending to meet and chat with him by chance for the past few days, but it was all in vain. While she was secretly venting her anger, Feng Tianyi had already slid to the other end of the iron chain and led Ning Xuemore to the other 6 levels. Young people liked to watch the fun. Naturally, they didn't want to miss such a big show like Ning Xuemore breaking through the checkpoint alone, so they all followed her. After these disciples left, 2 disciples appeared at the edge of the pool. They pointed their fingers at the pool, and in the blink of an eye, the fierce flood dragon in the pool turned into a big bubble. Inside the bubble were the few intern disciples who had fallen down. When these intern disciples were released, they were still dizzy and disoriented. They didn't know if they were alive or dead. A disciple came forward and patted them on the shoulder, telling them that they had failed the selection and could leave the mountain immediately. After everyone left, a man in white appeared on the platform where Ning Xuemore and the others had been standing. Elegant and elegant, he was the Sun Moon sect's chief steward, Yelu Jing'an. He looked at the direction where Ning Xuemore and the others had disappeared and concentrated for a moment. He took out a golden sound-transmitting talisman. Chapter 8:13. Yelu Jing'an wanted to pick it up but was hesitant. He paused for a moment and sighed. In the end, he didn't pick it up and put it back into his pocket. Although Miss Ning was injured now, her life wasn't in danger. It wasn't a critical moment, so he didn't want to disturb the ancestors' cultivation. However, could Miss Ning really pass the 6 tests in 12 hours? She had promised in front of everyone. If she couldn't pass, the ancestor wouldn't be able to accept her even if he wanted to go back on his words. That person was planning this, wasn't he? He didn't expect that person to go against the ancestor's orders and set such a big trap for Miss Ning. Perhaps he should start from the 6 tests and go easy on Ning Xuemore? As he was thinking of a countermeasure, the voice transmission talisman on his waist suddenly lit up. He frowned slightly. It was from that person. He picked it up and heard a cold voice, "Come to the secret room to see me quickly. Otherwise, you will have to bear the consequences." Yelu Jing'an, in a clean room that looked like it was made of ice and snow. The ancestor sat on a cold couch and looked at Yelu Jing'an with sharp eyes. "You want to help her?" Yelu Jing'an took a deep breath and didn't hide it. "Yes, the ancestor personally ordered me to take care of her. I was just following the ancestor's orders." The ancestor lowered his eyes slightly. "So he didn't really believe me?" Yelu Jing'an looked at him with cold eyes. "In fact, you really can't be trusted. The ancestor asked you to bring her out of the mystifying illusionary realm safely, but you let her suffer such serious injuries. Since she wants to be the ancestor's disciple, she will have to go there alone sooner or later." "I just brought it forward," said the ancestor. "But she is only at the Earth tier level 2. The beast you released in the mystifying illusionary realm was the Yazi beast. This beast can only pass if it cultivated to the Earth tier level 5. Yelu Jing'an had secretly observed Ning Xuemore's injuries. It was the Yazi beast that injured her. Thinking of this, he still had lingering fears. If she was really torn apart by the Yazi beast, how are you going to explain it to the ancestor? "I know what to do." The ancestor's voice was cold. Since the ancestor gave her special treatment, she should have special abilities. "There was nothing wrong with what I did. I'm also testing her aptitude." "Then what are the results of your investigation?" Yelu Jing'an asked. "Barely." The overlord answered with 4 words. Yelu Jing'an couldn't help but sneer. "You let an Earth stage level 2 girl fight a level 5 beast, and you say she barely passed? This girl is obviously one of a kind." The venerable sovereign didn't say anything. Yelu Jing'an took a deep breath. "Since you think she has passed, why did you give her such a difficult task, making her pass the 6 trials in 12 hours? You clearly know that this is as difficult as ascending to the heavens. You just don't want her to become the ancestor's disciple, right? Everything else was just an excuse. Why? Why are you doing this? If she doesn't pass the exam and takes someone else as her master, the ancestor will definitely settle accounts with you when he returns. The ancestor lowered his eyes slightly and said in a soft voice, I know, but I have to do this. Why? Because she is a heavenly calamity lone star. The ancestor took a light breath, and his voice was even colder. Since the ancestor became friends with her, there has been a lot of problems. Her fate as a heavenly calamity lone star cannot be changed easily. The ancestor has already been implicated by her. Chapter 8:14. If Ning Xuemore becomes the ancestor's disciple, who knows how much trouble she'll cause. I can't let her harm the entire Sun-Moon sec. Yelu Jing'an. I think the ancestor knows what he's doing. How can you meddle in his affairs? The ancestor's eyes were cold and sharp. She might be the ancestor's origin tribulation. Even if I have to die, I can't let anything happen to the ancestor. Yelu Jing'an. She couldn't get through to him. Yelu Jing'an didn't want to be entangled with him anymore, so she turned and left. The ancestor's figure flashed, and he suddenly appeared in front of Yelu Jing'an. He reached out and grabbed a golden sound-transmitting talisman from Yelu Jing'an's body. Then he retreated like flowing water and sat down on the white jade praying mat. His movements were too slow to be described as lightning. In the blink of an eye, he had completed this series of actions and sat down as if he hadn't moved at all. Yelu Jing'an's expression changed, and she abruptly turned back. Why did you steal my sound-transmitting talisman? Give it back. He had stolen the sound-transmitting talisman that Yelu Jing'an used to communicate with the ancestor. The ancestor raised his hand, and an ice wall appeared in front of him, blocking Yelu Jing'an's movements. His voice was incomparably cold. I'll return it to you in 12 hours. He looked at Yelu Jing'an with cold eyes. Don't try to help her. I'm just letting her know the difficulty and retreat. I don't want to take her life. If you blindly help her, I don't know what I'll do to prevent future trouble. Yelu Jing'an stiffened. Are you threatening me? No, I'm just telling you. I mean what I say. If you don't want her to die, then don't do anything. Yelu Jing'an was furious. The ancestor won't forgive you when he comes back. I've said it before. For the ancestor's safety, I've already risked my life. The ancestor's reply was indifferent. Yelu Jing'an. What you're doing is unfair to that girl. She's qualified to have the ancestor as her master. My mission is to protect. I don't care about anything else. The ancestor closed his eyes. You can scram. If they really fought, Yelu Jing'an wasn't a match for the ancestor, so he could only choose to leave. After pausing outside for a moment, he headed towards the place where Ning Xuemore was challenging the trial. Even if he couldn't help her pass the trial, he could still protect her a little. No matter what, he would never allow Ning Xuemore's life to be in danger. He knew that the first obstacle Ning Xuemore had to pass was the Bronze Men Alley. There were all kinds of bronze men whose skills were around Earth rank level 1. These bronze men were more flexible than real people. When they attacked people, they would automatically arrange themselves into a formation. Normally, when passing through this array, they would form a group of 3. Chapter 8:15. She passed the first level? This was too fast. Only a little over an hour had passed. How did she do it? Yelu Jing'an stood under the shadow of a large tree, watching the group of new disciples escorting Ning Xuemore as they walked out. Ning Xuemore had already changed into a lotus pink dress, her small face faintly blushing. Her lips had a smile and her steps were unhurried. That pair of large eyes flashed with an ink-black luster under the sunlight. At this moment, she was confident and calm. Even though there were all kinds of beauties around her, none of them could cover up her radiance. In this place where beauties gathered, she might not be the most beautiful, but where she was, everyone else seemed to have become a moving background. This kind of girl would become the center of attention no matter where she went. Not to mention that she had just easily broken a record. She was the fastest person to pass this level. The youths that came to watch the excitement looked at her with inquisitive, curious, and faint adoration. Intentionally or unintentionally, they approached her and tried to say a few words to her. Ning Xuemore was not cold and arrogant. When it was necessary, she still had a good temper when she wasn't provoked. She talked and laughed with these people as she walked to the next level. Yelu Jing'an used an invisibility technique, so these people didn't see him when they passed by, and no one looked in his direction. Only Ning Xuemore, with her naturally sensitive sixth sense, walked under the large tree and suddenly looked in Yelu Jing'an's direction. This made Yelu Jing'an's heart jump. This girl was able to see through his invisibility technique. Actually, he was thinking too much. Ning Xuemore didn't see him, she just felt something and looked over. She quickly turned her head and continued to talk with the people beside her. Even though her body was close to 14 years old, her soul was old. Looking at the group of girls and boys beside her, she felt like they were still young children. Seeing their undisguised worshipful gazes, Ning Xuemore coughed in her heart. In fact, the layout of the Bronze Men Alley was similar to the Wooden Dummies Alley of the Shaolin Temple. She liked mechanisms, so she naturally entered the Wooden Dummies Alley to study it. She even figured out several ways to fight it. Although the mechanical techniques in her era were different from the ones in the real world, there were still many similarities between the two. After that, she had solved the Wooden Dummies Alley like it was a toy. Now that she had broken through the Bronze Men Alley again, it would not be a problem for her. If one didn't know how to break it, they would naturally be entangled by the bronze men inside. It would be considered a skill if they could break out within 2 hours. However, an expert like Ning Xuemore was very relaxed. After she entered, she quickly found the key points of the mechanisms on the bronze figures, making them unable to move. Then, she swaggered out of the room. She passed this stage with the least pressure and almost no MF was used. The second trial was on a vast and misty lake. Scattered lotus leaves floated in the lake. And Ning Xuemore needed to step on these lotus leaves to run to the small island in the center of the lake, then pick a fruit from there and bring it back. This was a test of people's Qigong. To these Earth Stage disciples, Qigong was not a difficult thing to do. The difficult part was that these floating lotus leaves were spinning rapidly in the lake. From time to time, they would change their position at lightning speed. When you lifted your foot, you would see the lotus leaves in one position, but when you landed, they would change to another position, making it easy for people to step on empty air. Chapter 8:16. And this round trip wasn't short at all, it was a full 30 miles. This round trip didn't only test one's lightness skill, it also tested one's judgment, eyesight, and endurance. Not a single one of these could be missing. In this place, one was allowed to fall into the water twice. Those who fell into the water more than twice or exceeded the set time limit would be eliminated. The best record in this round was Feng Jiaxin. Not only did she not fall into the water once, the time she used was also the shortest. She used half an hour, which was also 1 hour. And Helian Xiao fell behind by 1 point to become the second place. After Feng Jiaxin came here, she thought of the glory she created and couldn't help but smile. I only used half an hour to run here. This is the fastest. No one has ever broken this record. I wonder how long Miss Ning will take to run here. Ning Xuemore stood by the lake and observed the changing pattern of the lotus leaves. When she heard her words, she didn't even turn her head and said, "Wait for me to burst your chrysanthemum, Feng Jiaxin." Although she didn't understand what Ning Xuemore meant, she knew it wasn't something good. She was so angry that she secretly clenched her fist. She hoped that Ning Xuemore could fall into the water a few times. Ning Xuemore looked at the vast lake and rejoiced in her heart. She was lucky to have overcome her hydrophobia. Otherwise, she wouldn't be able to pass this round. Feng Jiaxin smiled coldly at the side. "If you can go back and forth once in half an hour and break my record, I'll call you Grandma." Ning Xuemore finally glanced at her. Suddenly, she lightly smiled. "Do you want to compete with me here?" Feng Jiaxin was stunned. I've already passed this round. Ning Xuemore smiled leisurely. It's just a competition with me. Could it be that you're so tired that you don't have any strength? I've passed one more round than you. If you want to say that I'm tired, I'm more tired than you. Of course, if you don't have the guts, then forget it. I can do it myself. Feng Jiaxin's eyes turned. I can compete with you, but there needs to be a prize. What prize? Tell me. Ning Xuemore folded her arms, looking like she was listening. Feng Jiaxin snorted and said, if you lose to me, you will automatically give up on the other 4 trials and give up the idea of worshipping Di Zun as your master. Ning Xuemore agreed readily, sure. However, if you lose, you will also give up the right to take Di Zun as your master. Feng Jiaxin paused for a moment, and a light flashed in her eyes. All right. That's it. This was her strong point. She had run once, so she knew the movement pattern of these lotus leaves. She would have a great advantage if she ran a second time. She didn't believe that she would lose to Ning Xuemore. If he could use this method to eliminate Ning Xuemore without shedding a drop of blood, it would not be a bad idea. The stakes were a little high. Everyone looked at each other. They had seen Feng Jiaxin's performance here, so naturally, they didn't think highly of Ning Xuemore. Helian Xiao couldn't help but say, Xuemore, this isn't fair. You're already injured, and you've just passed 2 trials in a row. Your body is already tired. And a certain person has already passed 1 trial today, so his body is still full of energy. She has also run once, so she's familiar with the process. This is too unfair to you. You can't agree to this bet. Ning Xuemore seemed to be moved by his words. She tapped her forehead with her finger. What you said is indeed reasonable. It's really unfair to me. Feng Jiaxin's heart sank, fearing that she would go back on her words. Ning Xuemore, you won't go back on your words, right? We've already agreed. Chapter 8:17. Ning Xuemore glanced at her. It's just a verbal promise. It only counts if Brother Feng is the witness. Feng Lianyi was actually not optimistic about Ning Xuemore's chances in this test. He still hoped that Ning Xuemore could challenge other tests and not stop here. So he immediately nodded. The bet hasn't been established yet, so it doesn't count. Feng Jiaxin was anxious. Ning Xuemore, what's the point of going back on your words like this? Don't tell me you're afraid of me. Ning Xuemore hugged her arms. Afraid of you? What a joke. I just feel that the bet just now was really unfair. Then what do you want to be fair? Feng Jiaxin blurted out. Ning Xuemore rubbed her forehead. Change the bet a little, and I might play with you. Change how? Ning Xuemore glanced at her again and said word by word, since we're going to bet, we might as well make it big. What big? The loser will voluntarily withdraw from the Sun Moon sect's disciple selection. Immediately leave the Sun Moon sect. Ning Xuemore stated her condition. She really didn't like this little white lotus and didn't want to see such a person stay in the Sun Moon sect. However, her talent was so high. Even if she couldn't become the disciple of an ancestor, she could still become the disciple of an elder of the Sun Moon sect. At that time, they would have to see each other frequently. So she might as well take this opportunity to drive her out. Feng Jiaxin. Her expression changed slightly. This bet was really too big for her. Her goal was to become the disciple of an ancestor. Even if she was the worst, she could still become the disciple of Yelu Jing'an. If she agreed to Ning Xuemore's bet and lost, she wouldn't even have the chance to become a disciple of the Sun Moon sect. While she was pondering, Ning Xuemore had already started preparing to run. If you don't say anything, then it means you don't want to bet. Then I'll pass this test myself. She was scared. She actually couldn't win against her, so she took the chance to withdraw the bet. She couldn't fall for her trick. What's more, he was the best at this. Winning against her was almost certain. If she missed this opportunity, she wouldn't be able to chase this lass away again. Feng Jiaxin's mind was filled with countless thoughts in a split second. She steeled her heart and clenched her fists in her sleeves as she declared in a clear voice, I'll take the bet. She was willing to risk everything in order to become the ancestor's disciple. Ning Xuemore smiled and sighed. I didn't think you'd really gamble. Silly child, you'll regret it. Her gaze fell on Feng Lianyi. Brother Feng, can you bear witness for us? The stakes were unprecedentedly high, and Feng Lianyi couldn't make up his mind. Feng Jiaxin was a top-notch talent. The protectors and elders of the Sun-Moon sect had already taken notice of her. It was unknown how many people wanted to snatch her to join their own sect. It would be too much of a pity if such a talent was lost to the Sun-Moon sect just because of a bet. As for Ning Xuemore, although her psychokinesis was a little weak, her other abilities were all top-notch. She was also an extremely rare talent, and the Sun-Moon sect didn't want to lose her, but with this bet, they would definitely lose one of them. He was only a guide disciple, so he couldn't make such a big decision. So he coughed. Both of you are top-notch talents, so why make such a big bet just because of a momentary dispute? Just as he was about to deny their bet, a faint voice suddenly sounded. This elder can bear witness for you. That voice was clear and gentle, but it also carried a hint of sharpness. Chapter 8:18. Everyone stared blankly and looked in the direction of the voice. A white-clothed man appeared under a big tree. Feng Lianyi immediately rushed forward to pay his respects. Master. The person who came was the Sun-Moon sect's general manager, the one with the actual power, Yilu Jing'an. Once he appeared, everyone present bowed down. The eyes of those young men and women flashed with light. Yilu Jing'an was also a legendary figure, a great god revered by all. These people had heard of him for a long time, so they were naturally excited to see him. Yilu Jing'an waved his hand and a faint silver light flashed. No one could continue to bow. You are all not official disciples of the Sun-Moon sect, no need to be polite. His gaze swept around again and the corner of his mouth hooked up. I say, it's not good for you to be invisible, right? Come out. No one knew who he was talking about and subconsciously looked around. Ning Xuemore's heart skipped a beat. Her eyes quickly circled around her before stopping at a large boulder. That big rock suddenly shook and turned into a green-clothed man in the blink of an eye. He laughed loudly. Little 15, why don't you let us secretly watch the show? What's the point of drinking? Yilu Jing'an smiled. Ninth senior brother didn't say anything when you returned, but squatted here to watch the show. I almost didn't see you. That green-clothed man was also a handsome person. He chatted with Yilu Jing'an for a while before his gaze fell on Ning Xuemore. This little girl isn't simple. She actually saw through my disguise after looking around. He was in high spirits. Little girl, there are still 3 who haven't shown themselves. Can you find them? Ning Xuemore heard their conversation and knew that this person was also the ancestor's disciple, ranked 9th. She didn't hold back and continued to look around. Her gaze fell on a slender and elegant lotus flower in the water and she smiled. That lotus swayed, and a circle of green light flashed. Unexpectedly, it transformed into a man wearing a long white robe. His facial features were elegant and refined. His figure flashed and landed on the lakeside. He faced Ning Xuemore and elegantly smiled. Little miss, not only are your eyes poisonous, your smile is also very sweet. Yilu Jing'an stepped forward to greet him. 12th Shixiang. When the crowd saw that another handsome guy had appeared, they naturally went into an uproar. Ning Xuemore was, after all, a special agent. She was very observant and was used to seeing through other people's disguises. Coupled with her current cultivation, her eyesight was even sharper. Her gaze landed on a weapon rack and half a piece of dead wood. Every time she paused, a handsome man would appear. 3 minutes. It only took her 3 minutes to find out who the 3 handsome men were. As they exchanged greetings, Ning Xuemore also learned about their identities. They were all disciples of the ancestor. Although their temperaments and personalities were different, there was no doubt that they were all extremely handsome. These people should be very old. The youngest one was more than 100 years old, and the oldest one should be 700 or 800 years old. However, each one of them looked like they were 24 or 25 years old. They were in their prime, and people couldn't help but marvel at the magic of telekinesis. Among these people, 3 had already cultivated to Earth rank level 10 and were in the process of breaking through to Heaven rank. The weakest one was at Earth rank level 8.5 and was about to break through to Earth rank level 9. After breaking through to Heaven rank, one wouldn't age and die. After breaking through to Earth rank level 6, one could live for more than 2,000 years. Today was an eye-opener for everyone. Chapter 8:19. Don't underestimate the difference between level 6 and level 10. Earth rank level 6 and above was an extremely difficult hurdle. The amount of MF needed to advance from rank 6 to rank 7 was 3 times the amount of MF needed to advance from human rank 1 to Earth rank 5. The higher you go, the harder it is to rise. It was just like climbing a mountain. It was easy to climb up from the bottom, but once you reached a certain height, it would be extremely difficult to climb up again. In this continent, those who could cultivate to Earth rank 10 were as rare as phoenix feathers and unicorn horns. There were less than 10 people in the entire continent. 7 of these people were the disciples of the Sun-Moon sect sovereigns. The ancestor had a habit of banishing a disciple after accepting one. Unless they were in charge of the Sun-Moon sect, all of them would be kicked out to establish their own sects. Of course, this independent sect was actually occupying a mountain and accepting disciples. It could be considered a branch of the Sun-Moon sect. The 4 men who had just appeared were the branch leaders of the various branches of the Sun-Moon sect. Every single one of them had recruited quite a few disciples, and these disciples had recruited more disciples, and so on and so forth. The Sun-Moon sect grew stronger and stronger, and more people joined. In recent years, they had basically stopped accepting disciples. Most of the new disciples had become their grand disciples, or their grand disciples' grand disciples' grand disciples' grand disciples. Only when they came across a truly high-quality jade would they have the thought of taking in a disciple. Among this batch of new disciples, they had also heard of Feng Jiaxin and Helian Xiao's reputations. They were all prepared to go take a look at the final competition. These people were branch lords, so their eyes and ears weren't ordinary people. Naturally, they had heard about Ning Shuamore's sudden appearance and her promise to the ancestor that she would pass 6 stages in a row. Everyone's curiosity was piqued, and they all ran over at the same time. The conversation between Ning Shuamore and Feng Jiaxin naturally fell into their ears. These people had lived for hundreds of years, and Feng Jiaxin's little girl tricks were nothing in their eyes. Since they paid attention to Feng Jiaxin, they naturally investigated her thoroughly. They had a kind of evaluation of her in their hearts, but they just didn't say it out loud. The thing that the Sun-Moon sect did not lack the least was prodigies. Thus, they did not regard Feng Jiaxin and the others very highly. What they were really interested in was Ning Shuamore, a dark horse who had appeared out of nowhere. For someone who used to be trash to reach Earth rank level 2 in just a few months, this was already a legend. Not to mention the fact that she had a cute Kirine by her side. She even dared to openly challenge the venerable sovereign and inexplicably came out of the dark forest alone. Most importantly, she dared to promise that she would pass the 6 stages within 12 hours. One had to know that they hadn't been able to do it back then. This made them even more curious. On the surface, they looked calm and collected, but in reality, they had already glanced at Ning Shuamore countless times. They were just short of getting a radar and giving her a full body scan. After Ning Shuamore broke through the first trial, they felt that she wasn't simple at all. When Ning Shuamore quickly saw through her disguise, their curiosity towards her simply rose to the peak. Originally, they wanted to stay invisible and take a look before returning home. But now, they were no longer in a hurry. They wanted to follow them throughout the entire process. He wanted to witness it with his own eyes. With these god-level characters here, Feng Lianyi naturally didn't need to make the decision. Yelu Jing'an looked at his senior brothers and discussed with them, "These 2 young ladies have made a bet, and this little brother wants to be a witness. Senior brothers, do you want to be a witness as well?" The 4 looked at Ning Shuamore, then looked at Feng Jiaxin. They actually agreed quite readily, "Okay." Chapter 8:20. With several masters as witnesses, Feng Jiaxin didn't have the guts to back out even if she wanted to. She couldn't help but look at Ning Xuemo. Ning Xuemo smiled gently at her. "Little girl, try your best." Feng Jiaxin was stiff and refused to be outdone. "You too." With 5 masters as witnesses and a bet that would decide a person's fate, everyone's blood began to boil. Everyone opened their eyes wide, waiting for the peak battle. Feng Lianyi said, "Start." 2 figures, one red and one white, fell into the lake at the same time. Everyone knew that since Ning Xuemo dared to make this bet with Feng Jiaxin, she must have some skills. But they didn't expect her skills to be a super thunderbolt. She could simply defeat all the monsters. Her figure was like lightning, passing by those floating lotus leaves in the lake. Her clothes fluttered in the wind, like a flaming flower shooting out. Although there was no mechanism under the floating lotus leaves in the lake, people would still stagger and stop if they didn't tap on it. Those who couldn't control their balance would directly fall into the water. Feng Jiaxin, who had passed through it once, still paused from time to judge when she ran for the second time. Ning Xuemo didn't judge at all. She didn't stop at all. All her movements were as smooth as floating clouds and flowing water. It didn't seem like she was leaping on the lotus leaves in the water. Instead, it seemed like she was running on an ordinary road. In just a few minutes, Feng Jiaxin was left far behind. Feng Jiaxin's face changed. She didn't expect Ning Xuemo to be so abnormal. The changing position of these lotus leaves coincided with the 8 diagrams. Ning Xuemo just stood by the lake for a little while and chatted with others. How could she know all the footholds? This was illogical. Illogical. The more anxious she was, the harder it was for her to calm down. At this time, she couldn't calm down, so she couldn't make a correct judgment in the shortest time. She was so angry that she almost stepped on the wrong foot and fell into the water. When Feng Jiaxin's body swayed, she suddenly felt that there was wind under her feet. Then she rushed forward like a whirlwind. His speed was twice as fast as before. Everyone on the shore was watching. Originally, their attention was focused on Ning Xuemo's graceful and agile movements. When they noticed Feng Jiaxin, she had almost caught up with Ning Xuemo. Because the distance was too far, the crowd couldn't see her real footwork clearly. They could only see that her body seemed to be blown forward by the wind, and her feet almost didn't touch the ground. I didn't expect Feng Jiaxin to have such superb martial arts. This scene was also beyond everyone's expectations. Everyone was both surprised and curious. Especially those who had seen her pass the test the first time, they were even more surprised. The first time she did it, there was a slight pause. What was going on this time? Did he perform better than usual? The lotus leaves in the lake changed according to the order of the 8 trigrams. Ning Xuemo was very familiar with the 8 trigrams, so when she crossed this stage, she would not make a mistake even if she closed her eyes. Coupled with her expeditious steps, her speed was even faster. When she was running, she naturally felt Feng Jiaxin's sudden increase in speed. She was a little surprised in her heart. Ning Xuemo inwardly took a deep breath. She increased her pace once again. Just a moment ago, she was still leisurely, but now, she was going all out. Her speed suddenly doubled. On the surface of the water, only 2 figures could be seen running further and further away. In a moment, there were only 2 small black dots left. Awesome. Awesome. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.